Welcome back to Verified Fears, where real terror lives on the open road. Tonight, we're bringing you 11 true accounts from drivers who encountered the impossible on America's highways. These aren't fictional tales or urban legends. These are genuine experiences from real people who found themselves face to face with something that shouldn't exist on roads traveled by millions every day. From phantom passengers that appear in rearview mirrors to radio stations broadcasting from decades past, each story will leave you questioning what's really out there in the darkness beyond your headlights. So buckle up and prepare yourself for 11 disturbing true encounters that prove sometimes the most terrifying journeys happen on roads that should be perfectly safe. My name is Kobe, and what I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago on a stretch of Interstate 80 that I'll never drive again, not even in broad daylight. I work as an insurance adjuster, which means I spend a lot of time on the road investigating claims, photographing accident scenes, and interviewing people about the worst days of their lives. It's not glamorous work, but it pays well. And I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me until that night in October 2019, when I learned that some passengers don't need doors to get into your car. I was driving back from Reno to Sacramento after wrapping up a particularly complex fraud investigation that had kept me there for 3 days longer than expected. The case involved a suspicious multi-vehicle accident where none of the stories lined up. And after reviewing surveillance footage from 6 different angles, I'd finally proven that the whole thing was staged. It was the kind of victory that should have had me feeling good. But instead, I just felt drained and eager to get home to my apartment and my cat, Mr. Whiskers, who was probably wondering why his dinner was 3 days late. The company had booked me a flight for the next morning, but I hate flying. And the 5-hour drive through Nevada's high desert had always been therapeutic for me, especially at night when the traffic was light and I could just cruise with my thoughts and whatever music happened to come through the radio static. It was just past midnight when I merged onto I-80 westbound, and the highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon under a moonless sky. The desert out there is different from anywhere else I've ever been. It's not just empty, it's aggressively empty. Like the landscape is actively pushing away any sign of human presence, except for the thin strip of asphalt cutting through it. My headlights carved a small bubble of reality in the darkness, illuminating maybe 100 yards of road ahead, before everything dissolved into absolute blackness. I had my cruise control set at 75, just above the speed limit, but not enough to attract attention from any state troopers who might be lurking behind the occasional overpass. The radio was picking up a classic rock station out of Salt Lake City, and I was listening to some Fleetwood Mac when I first saw her in my rearview mirror. She was standing maybe 50 yards behind my car, right in the middle of the highway, illuminated by my taillights. An elderly woman in what looked like a faded blue dress, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and one arm extended as if she were trying to flag down a ride. My first instinct was to slam on the brakes. You don't just leave an old lady stranded on a desert highway in the middle of the night. But something about the scene made me hesitate. There were no broken down cars visible anywhere, no explanation for how she might have gotten there. And more unsettling, she wasn't moving the way a real person would move. She was just standing perfectly still, like a photograph, while my car pulled away from her at 75 miles per hour. I checked my side mirrors, thinking maybe I'd misunderstood what I was seeing. But she was definitely there in the rearview mirror, getting smaller as the distance between us increased, but never disappearing entirely. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over to the shoulder, my hazard lights blinking as I put the car in reverse. But when I looked back down the highway, there was nothing there. Just empty asphalt stretching into the darkness, with no sign that anyone had ever been standing there at all. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, engine idling, trying to convince myself that I'd been seeing things. Road hypnosis, they call it, when you've been driving too long and your brain starts filling in details that aren't really there. It made sense. I'd been awake for nearly 18 hours, and the investigation in Reno had been stressful enough to mess with anyone's perception. I pulled back onto the highway, cranked up the air conditioning to help me stay alert, and tried to focus on getting home. But 15 miles later, she was back. Same woman, same blue dress, same outstretched arm, standing in the exact same spot in my rearview mirror about 50 yards behind the car. This time, I was absolutely certain she hadn't been there seconds before. I'd been checking my mirrors religiously since the first sighting, and the road behind me had been completely empty. But now, she was back, as clear as day in the red glow of my taillights. And this time, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Her eyes were looking directly at me through the mirror, as if she could see me watching her. And there was something in her expression that wasn't quite right. Something hungry and desperate that made me want to floor the accelerator instead of stopping to help. But I'm not the kind of person who leaves someone stranded, especially not an elderly woman in the middle of nowhere. I pulled over again, this time leaving the engine running and the headlights on as I got out of the car. The desert air was cold and thin, and the silence was so complete that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I walked back along the shoulder, my phone's flashlight cutting a weak beam through the darkness, calling out to ask if she was okay and if she needed help. But again, there was no one there. No footprints in the sand beside the road, no evidence that anyone had ever been standing on that stretch of highway. And most unsettling of all, no sound except for the distant hum of my car's engine and the faint whistle of wind across the desert. The third time she appeared, I didn't stop. I just kept driving. Hands gripped tight on the steering wheel, trying to ignore the way she seemed to be getting closer in the mirror, despite the fact that I was maintaining a steady 75 miles per hour. By the fourth sighting, she was close enough that I could make out details that should have been impossible to see at that distance and speed. Her dress wasn't just blue. It was a specific shade of powder blue with small white flowers printed on it, and it looked like something from the 1950s or 60s. Her hair wasn't just gray. It was silver white and perfectly styled in victory rolls that belonged to a different era entirely. And her eyes, which had been hard to make out before, were now clearly visible and focused directly on mine with an intensity that made me break out in a cold sweat. That's when I made the mistake of looking away from the road ahead to get a better look at her in the rearview mirror. In the split second that I turned my attention to the mirror, she moved. Not walked, not ran, but simply appeared closer, as if the distance between us had collapsed without any movement on her part. She was now maybe 20 yards behind the car, close enough that I could see the expression on her face clearly. And what I saw there made me understand that whatever this was, it wasn't someone who needed help. Her mouth was open as if she were screaming, but no sound was coming through the glass. And her arm wasn't extended for a ride. It was reaching for something, grasping at the air between us with fingers that seemed too long and too pale to be entirely human. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, pushing my sedan well beyond the speed limit as the speedometer climbed past 80, then 90, then 100 miles per hour. The woman in the mirror kept pace effortlessly, never falling behind, despite the fact that she appeared to be standing still. It was like she existed in a bubble of space that moved with my car, always maintaining that same 20-yard distance no matter how fast I drove. The highway began to curve as it approached the California border, and I took those curves at speeds that should have sent me spinning off into the sagebrush. but somehow the car held the road as if something else was guiding it. That's when she appeared in my passenger seat. Not gradually, not by opening a door or climbing through a window, but simply materialized in the seat beside me, like she'd been there all along. The same elderly woman from the highway, still wearing that powder blue dress with white flowers, still reaching for something with those unnaturally long fingers. But now I could smell her, a combination of old perfume and something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in stagnant water. She turned to look at me, and her eyes were completely black, not just the irises but the whites as well, like looking into two deep holes that went nowhere. I want to say I kept control of the car, that I handled the situation like the rational adult I usually am. But the truth is, I screamed and yanked the steering wheel hard to the right. The car lurched off the highway and onto the shoulder, kicking up a cloud of dust and gravel as I fought to bring it to a stop. When I finally got control and looked over at the passenger seat, she was gone. Just gone. Like she'd never been there at all, leaving behind only the lingering scent of old perfume and the unmistakable impression in the seat cushion where someone had been sitting. I sat there on the side of the highway for the better part of an hour, engine running, doors locked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Eventually, I worked up the courage to continue driving. But I kept the radio turned up loud and all the windows cracked to keep the air circulating. Anything to avoid the suffocating silence that seemed to invite her back. The rest of the drive passed without incident, and by the time I reached Sacramento, the sun was beginning to rise over the Sierra Nevada mountains, turning the sky a pale orange that made the whole experience feel like a nightmare I was finally waking up from. But it wasn't over. The next day, curiosity got the better of me, and I did what any insurance investigator would do. I researched. It took some digging through old newspaper archives and state police records, but I eventually found what I was looking for. In 1967, a woman named Dorothy Henshaw had been killed in a hit-and-run accident on that exact stretch of I-80. She'd been 63 years old, traveling alone from Reno to visit her daughter in California, when her car broke down in the desert. She'd gotten out to flag down help and was struck by a passing truck whose driver never stopped. The newspaper photo showed a woman in a powder blue dress with white flowers, her silver hair styled in victory rolls that were popular in that era. The article mentioned that her body was found 20 yards from her disabled vehicle, one arm extended as if she'd been trying to signal for help when she was hit. The case was never solved, and Dorothy Henshaw was buried in a small cemetery outside Sacramento, with no one ever held accountable for her death. According to the investigation reports, several drivers had called in sightings of an elderly woman on that stretch of highway over the years, but police who responded never found anyone there. I've driven that route exactly once since then, in broad daylight with a co-worker in the passenger seat, and saw nothing unusual. But I've heard from other drivers who've had similar experiences, always at night, always alone, always involving the same elderly woman in the powder blue dress. Some say she's looking for justice. Others think she's still trying to get home to her daughter, who's probably been dead for years now herself. Me? I think she's just lost. Stuck in those final moments before the truck hit her, forever trying to flag down help that will never come. What I know for certain is that some roads hold on to their secrets, and some passengers don't need an invitation to get into your car. Dorothy Henshaw has been riding with night drivers on I-80 for over 50 years now, and I don't think she's planning to stop anytime soon. My name is Freya, and I'm a traveling nurse, which means I spend more time on highways than most people spend in their own living rooms. I've driven through every state in the continental United States, navigating by GPS through mountain passes, desert stretches, and rural back roads that don't appear on most maps. I thought I'd encountered every possible road hazard, from sudden blizzards in Colorado to flash floods in Texas. But nothing prepared me for what happened on Highway 50 through West Virginia in March 2021, when my GPS decided that mile marker 237 was the only place in the world I needed to be. I was driving from a contract in Virginia Beach to a new assignment at a rural hospital in Ohio, a route I'd planned carefully to avoid the worst of the mountain driving. My Honda Civic wasn't built for steep grades and winding roads, but the job paid well enough to justify the occasional white-knuckle drive through Appalachian terrain. The weather forecast had called for light rain, nothing that should have been a problem for someone who'd driven through everything from Gulf Coast hurricanes to Rocky Mountain snowstorms. I'd left Virginia Beach at noon, expecting to reach Ohio by late evening. But the light rain had turned into a steady downpour by the time I crossed into West Virginia, and the mountain fog was so thick that my headlights seemed to just disappear into a gray wall 20 feet in front of my car. That's when my GPS started acting strange. I'd been using the same navigation app for years, and it had never let me down, always finding the most efficient route and rerouting around traffic or construction without any problems. But as I climbed into the West Virginia mountains, the screen began flickering, showing my location jumping around randomly before settling on what appeared to be the correct position. The voice directions became choppy, cutting out mid-sentence or repeating the same instruction multiple times. I figured it was just the mountains interfering with the satellite signal. It wouldn't be the first time I'd lost GPS coverage in remote terrain, so I kept following the route as best I could, trusting that I was still heading in the right direction. The first time it rerouted me toward mile marker 237, I didn't think much of it. Highway construction is a constant reality for anyone who drives for a living, and GPS systems are usually pretty good about finding alternate routes when the main highway is blocked. The app showed a detour that would add maybe 15 minutes to my trip, taking me off Highway 50 onto what appeared to be a smaller state route that paralleled the main highway through a valley. The road was narrow and winding, cutting through dense forest that seemed to press in from both sides. But it was paved and well-maintained, clearly marked with reflective signs that showed up clearly in my headlights despite the fog and rain. But after following the detour for about 10 miles, I found myself back on Highway 50, right at mile marker 237. The same mile marker I'd passed 20 minutes earlier before taking the detour. I pulled over to check my GPS, thinking maybe I'd misunderstood the directions. But the screen showed that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, following the route to Ohio as planned. The strange thing was, there was no indication on the GPS that I'd taken any detour at all. According to the app, I'd been traveling straight down Highway 50 the entire time, never deviating from the main route. But I clearly remembered turning off the highway, driving through the forest on that narrow state route, and somehow ending up back where I started. I chalked it up to the fog and fatigue playing tricks on my perception. Night driving in bad weather can be disorienting, especially in unfamiliar mountain terrain where all the roads look the same and landmarks are impossible to see. I'd probably just gotten confused about which mile marker I'd passed. Or maybe I'd dozed off for a few seconds and dreamed the whole detour. It happens to long-distance drivers more often than we'd like to admit. So I continued on Highway 50, keeping my speed low and my attention focused on the road ahead, determined to power through the mountains and get to flatter terrain where the driving would be easier. But 30 minutes later, my GPS rerouted me again. Same female voice, same calm instructions to take the next exit and follow the detour around construction ahead. Same narrow state route winding through the forest, same reflective signs barely visible through the rain and fog. And same result, after following the detour for what felt like 10 miles of winding mountain road, I found myself back at mile marker 237, as if I'd never left. This time, I was certain I hadn't imagined it. I'd been watching the mile markers carefully, counting them off as I passed, and I'd definitely been beyond mile marker 240 when the GPS had directed me to take the detour. That's when I started to panic. I pulled over at the mile marker and tried to call for help, but my cell phone showed no signal. Not just weak signal, but absolutely no bars, as if I'd driven into a complete dead zone. I tried restarting the phone, thinking maybe it was a software glitch, but when it powered back up, it still showed no service. The GPS was still working, still showing my location at mile marker 237 on Highway 50, still plotting a route to Ohio that looked perfectly normal. But when I zoomed out on the map to get a better view of the area, something was wrong with the display. The roads around my location seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into different configurations, like the landscape itself was alive and constantly reshaping itself. I decided to ignore the GPS entirely and just keep driving straight on Highway 50, no matter what the app told me to do. I figured that as long as I stayed on the main highway and didn't take any turns, I'd eventually get through the mountains and back into cell phone range where I could call for help if needed. The rain was starting to let up, and I could see occasional breaks in the fog that revealed glimpses of the valley far below. I passed mile marker 238, then 239, then 240, counting each one carefully to make sure I was making progress. For a few minutes, it seemed like my plan was working, like I'd broken whatever strange loop had been trapping me at mile marker 237. But then I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. A single car, maybe half a mile behind me, traveling at exactly the same speed I was. That shouldn't have been unusual. Highway 50 is a major route through the mountains, and it's not uncommon to encounter other drivers even late at night. But something about this car bothered me. It maintained a perfect distance, never getting closer or falling farther behind, even when I sped up or slowed down. When I changed lanes, it changed lanes. When I turned on my hazard lights to test whether it was really following me, it turned on its hazard lights too, blinking in perfect synchronization with mine. I tried slowing down to let the car pass, pulling into the right lane and dropping my speed to 40 miles per hour. The car slowed down too, maintaining that same half-mile distance. I tried speeding up, pushing my Honda to 75 in a 60-mile-per-hour zone. The car kept pace effortlessly. In the brief moments when the fog cleared enough for me to see clearly, I could make out the shape of what looked like another small sedan, similar to my own car, but I could never quite see the license plate or make out any details about the driver. It was like looking at my own car in a mirror, following me through the mountains at the exact same speed, matching my every move. That's when my GPS spoke up again, directing me to take the next exit for a detour around construction ahead. The same calm female voice, the same instructions I'd heard twice before. This time, I ignored it completely, keeping my foot steady on the accelerator and my eyes fixed on the road ahead. But as I approached what should have been mile marker 242, I saw the exit sign for the detour, exactly where the GPS had said it would be. And despite my determination to stay on the main highway, I felt my hands turning the steering wheel to the right, taking the exit without any conscious decision on my part. The detour route looked exactly the same as before. Narrow pavement winding through dense forest, reflective signs catching my headlights, fog drifting between the trees like something alive. But this time, I noticed details I'd missed before. The trees on either side of the road weren't just dense, they were wrong somehow. Too perfectly symmetrical, arranged in patterns that didn't look natural. The reflective signs weren't standard highway markers, but something older, with fonts and designs that looked like they belonged to a different era. And when I looked in my rearview mirror, the car that had been following me was gone, as if it had vanished the moment I took the exit. The forest seemed to go on forever, mile after mile of identical winding road, with no landmarks, no intersections, no signs of human habitation. My fuel gauge, which had been at half a tank when I first reached mile marker 237, never seemed to change. The needle stuck in the same position despite the fact that I'd been driving for what felt like hours. The clock on my dashboard had stopped at 11:47 p.m. The digits frozen, as if time itself had become stuck in this stretch of mountain road. I tried the radio, hoping to pick up a local station that might give me some idea of where I was. But all I could get was static, punctuated by brief fragments of voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the detour ended. The forest opened up, the fog cleared, and I found myself back on Highway 50, right at mile marker 237. The same mile marker where this nightmare had started, with the same view of the valley below, the same curve in the road ahead. But now there were other cars stopped along the shoulder, their hazard lights blinking in the darkness. As I pulled over to join them, I could see the drivers standing beside their vehicles, looking just as confused and frightened as I felt. A middle-aged man in a pickup truck, a young woman in an SUV, an elderly couple in a minivan, all of them with the same expression of bewilderment and growing panic. The man in the pickup truck walked over to my car as I rolled down the window. "How long have you been here?" he asked, his voice shaky. I told him about the detours, about the GPS rerouting me to the same mile marker over and over again, about the car that had been following me through the forest. He nodded grimly and pointed to the other drivers. "We've all been through the same thing," he said. "Some of us have been stuck here for hours. The detour road, the forest, the GPS that won't work right. It's like we're trapped in some kind of loop. And the only place we can end up is right here at mile marker 237. We tried everything we could think of to break free from whatever was holding us there. We formed a convoy and drove together, thinking that maybe the phenomenon only affected individual cars. We tried driving in the opposite direction, back toward Virginia. But every road we took eventually led back to mile marker 237. We tried abandoning the GPS entirely and navigating by the stars, but the thick cloud cover made that impossible. We tried calling for help on our cell phones, but none of us had any signal, as if this stretch of highway existed in some kind of dead zone that cut us off from the outside world. It was nearly dawn when the loop finally broke. One moment we were standing beside our cars at mile marker 237, debating whether to try another convoy attempt. And the next moment I was alone on the highway, the other cars nowhere to be seen. My GPS was working normally again, showing a clear route to Ohio with no detours or construction delays. My cell phone had full signal strength, and when I called my supervisor to explain why I was running late, she acted like nothing unusual had happened. According to her, I'd only been out of contact for about 20 minutes, not the 6 hours I remembered spending trapped at mile marker 237. I've driven that route several times since then, always during daylight hours, and I've never seen mile marker 237 again. The mile markers on Highway 50 jumped from 236 directly to 238, as if 237 was removed from the highway system entirely. When I researched the area online, I found reports from other drivers who'd experienced similar phenomena. GPS systems that malfunction in that specific area. Detours that lead nowhere. Time distortions that leave travelers confused about how long they've been driving. The State Highway Department has no record of any construction or detours on that stretch of Highway 50, and no explanation for why so many GPS systems seem to malfunction in the same location. Some people think it's a natural phenomenon, something about the mountain geology that interferes with satellite signals and creates electromagnetic anomalies. Others believe it's something more supernatural, a kind of temporal trap that occasionally snares unwary travelers and holds them in a loop until some unknown condition is met. I don't know which explanation I prefer, but I do know that I'll never trust my GPS completely again, especially when it tries to route me around construction that might not exist on roads that might not lead anywhere except back to where I started. My name is Oakley, but everyone on the CB calls me Big Oak, and I've been running long haul for 23 years. Started when I was 22, fresh out of the Army, thinking the open road would be a good way to see the country and make decent money without anyone looking over my shoulder. I've driven through every state except Hawaii, obviously, hauled everything from furniture to livestock to hazardous materials that I'm not legally allowed to talk about. In all those years and all those miles, I thought I'd seen everything the highway could throw at me. Black ice in Montana, dust storms in Arizona, fog so thick in Oregon that you couldn't see your own hood ornament. But nothing prepared me for that night in September 2018, driving through rural Montana on Highway 287, when my CB radio started picking up distress calls from accidents that hadn't happened yet. I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Billings to Denver, running about 2 hours behind schedule because of a mandatory rest period that dispatch hadn't factored into the delivery time. It was one of those loads that pays well, but comes with a tight deadline, the kind of job that separates the professional drivers from the amateurs. The equipment was expensive and time-sensitive, some kind of specialized harvesting machinery that needed to be on a farm in Colorado before the morning shift started. My dispatcher had made it clear that this was a high-priority client, the kind that could make or break our company's relationship with a major agricultural supplier. The route took me through some of the most remote country in Montana, mile after mile of rolling hills and grassland broken only by the occasional ranch house or grain elevator silhouetted against the star-filled sky. It's beautiful country during the day, but at night it can feel like you're driving through absolute nothingness. Just your headlights carving a tunnel through the darkness, while the CB crackles with the voices of other drivers scattered across hundreds of miles of highway. That night the chatter was lighter than usual. A few owner-operators discussing fuel prices, a couple of company drivers complaining about their dispatchers, the usual mix of road conditions reports and general conversation that keeps long-haul drivers connected to the human race during those lonely midnight hours. It was just past 2 a.m. when I first heard Harold's voice. He was using the handle Mile High, which wasn't familiar to me. But there are thousands of drivers out there, and you can't know everyone. His transmission was crystal clear, none of the static or distortion you usually get from drivers operating at the edge of CB range. And his voice had that calm, professional tone that comes from years of experience behind the wheel. Breaker 19, this is Mile High eastbound on 287 at mile marker 158. Got a jackknifed semi blocking both lanes, advising all westbound traffic to take alternate routes. This is going to be tied up for a while. Come back. I was westbound on 287. Still about 15 miles from mile marker 158, so I keyed up my mic to thank him for the heads up. Much appreciated, Mile High. This is Big Oak westbound. I'll start looking for a detour route. What's your 20 on emergency response? But Harold didn't respond. And when I tried raising him again a few minutes later, there was no answer. CB radio can be funny that way. Atmospheric conditions, terrain, equipment problems can all affect transmission quality. So I didn't think much of his silence. What mattered was the information about the jackknifed truck, which would save me from getting stuck in a traffic jam that could last hours. But when I reached mile marker 158, there was no accident. No jackknifed semi, no emergency vehicles, no traffic backup, nothing but empty highway stretching into the Montana darkness. I slowed down and scanned both sides of the road carefully, thinking maybe the wreck had been cleared faster than expected or that I'd misunderstood Harold's location. But the highway was completely normal. And when I checked with other drivers on the CB, none of them reported any accidents or delays on that stretch of 287. It was like Harold's transmission had been describing some alternate version of the highway. A parallel reality where the accident existed but hadn't crossed over into the real world yet. 20 minutes later, Harold's voice crackled through my speaker again. Breaker 19, mile high eastbound on 287 at mile marker 174. Got a vehicle fire on the right shoulder, single car fully engulfed. Fire department en route, but advising all traffic to use left lane and reduce speed for emergency vehicles. Come back. This time, I was already past mile marker 174. But I pulled over and called it in to the Montana Highway Patrol, figuring that if there really was a car fire, they'd want to know about it. And the dispatcher took my information politely, but told me they hadn't received any reports of vehicle fires in that area. And when a patrol unit checked the location, they found nothing unusual. That's when I started to get concerned. 2 false reports from the same driver in less than an hour was more than just a coincidence or equipment malfunction. I tried raising Harold directly, using his mile-high handle, but got no response. Other drivers on the channel hadn't heard his transmissions at all, which was impossible given the clear, strong signal I'd been receiving. CB radio operates on specific frequencies with limited range, and for me to hear Harold so clearly, he would have had to be within about 10 or 15 miles of my position. Other drivers in that range should have heard his transmissions too, unless there was something very unusual about his radio setup. The third transmission came an hour later, just as I was passing through the small town of Three Forks. Harold's voice was as clear and professional as before. But this time, there was an urgency in his tone that hadn't been there in the previous calls. Breaker 19, emergency traffic, mile high eastbound on 287 at mile marker 192. We got a multi-vehicle accident with injuries. At least 3 cars, and possibly a motorcycle, blocking the left lane with debris in the right lane. Emergency vehicles are on scene, but traffic is backing up fast. All westbound drivers need to find alternate routes immediately. This is a serious situation. Come back. Mile marker 192 was still about 10 miles ahead of me, and this time I decided to investigate personally rather than relying on official reports. If Harold was playing some kind of prank or running some kind of scam, I wanted to know about it. And if there really were accidents happening exactly where and when he said they would, then I was dealing with something far stranger and more unsettling than radio equipment problems. I pushed my rig a little harder than usual, keeping an eye out for any signs of emergency vehicles or unusual activity ahead. But once again, when I reached mile marker 192, there was no accident. No multi-vehicle collision, no emergency vehicles, no traffic backup, nothing but the normal flow of late-night highway traffic. I pulled over at a truck stop just past the mile marker and called the highway patrol again. But they had no reports of any accidents in that area. The dispatcher was starting to sound annoyed with my calls, and I couldn't blame her. From her perspective, I was some trucker who kept reporting accidents that didn't exist, wasting emergency resources on false alarms. That's when I decided to do some research of my own. Truck stops are good places to gather information, and the one near mile marker 192 was a popular overnight stop for drivers running the Montana-Colorado corridor. The night clerk was a friendly guy named Pete, who'd been working there for 15 years, and he knew most of the regular drivers by sight, if not by name. When I described Harold's voice and asked about the mile-high handle, Pete's expression changed immediately. "You mean Harold Brewster?" Pete said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Drove for Mountain West Transport out of Denver. Ran this route twice a week for about 10 years. Good driver, always polite, always had time to chat about road conditions or weather. But Harold's been dead for 4 years now. Got murdered at a rest area down near Colorado Springs, some drifters looking for drug money. Terrible thing, Harold was just trying to get some sleep, and they beat him to death for maybe $50 in cash and whatever pills they thought he might be carrying in his cab." The hair on the back of my neck stood up as Pete continued. But here's the really strange part. Ever since Harold died, drivers have been reporting his voice on the CB during bad weather or dangerous road conditions. Always giving warnings about accidents or hazards, always trying to help other drivers stay safe. Most of the guys think it's just coincidence, maybe some other driver using Harold's old handle. But the voice is exactly the same. And the accidents he warns about? They happen, just not always when or where he says they will. Sometimes it's a few minutes later, sometimes it's a few miles down the road. But something always happens that matches his description. I spent the next 3 hours in that truck stop, talking to drivers who'd had similar experiences with Harold's phantom CB transmissions. The stories were remarkably consistent. Clear, professional-sounding warnings about traffic hazards that didn't exist yet, but would materialize shortly afterward, always in slightly different locations or with slightly different details. A jackknifed truck at mile marker 158 became a rollover accident at mile marker 161. A vehicle fire at mile marker 174 became an engine breakdown with hazard lights at mile marker 176. A multi-vehicle collision at mile marker 192 became a drunk driver stopped in the travel lane at mile marker 195. One driver, a veteran named Carol who'd been running this route for 30 years, told me she'd started keeping a logbook of Harold's warnings and the actual incidents that followed. According to her records, the phantom transmissions were about 90% accurate in predicting some kind of highway hazard, just off by a few minutes or a few miles. "It's like he can see what's about to happen," she said. "But he's looking at it from wherever he is now, and the perspective is a little different. Time and distance don't work the same way for him as they do for us." The most unsettling part of Carol's story was what happened when she tried to respond to one of Harold's transmissions. She'd keyed up her mic and said, "Thanks for the heads up, Mile High. This is Roadrunner. Stay safe out there." Harold's voice had come back immediately, as clear as if he were sitting in the cab next to her. "You too, Roadrunner. Watch out for the black ice at mile marker 203. It's worse than it looks. And Carol, tell my wife I'm sorry I never made it home for dinner that night. She's probably still waiting." Carol had never used her real name on the CB, and she'd never told Harold about her personal life during the few conversations they'd had when he was alive. But somehow, from wherever he was broadcasting, Harold knew exactly who she was. When she reached mile marker 203 20 minutes later, she found a state patrol car with its lights flashing, warning drivers about dangerous black ice conditions that weren't visible until you were right on top of them. I left that truck stop with a new respect for the mysteries of the highway and a different understanding of what it means to watch out for your fellow drivers. Over the next 5 years, I've heard Harold's voice maybe a dozen times. Always during dangerous weather or road conditions, always trying to keep other drivers safe. Sometimes his warnings are exactly accurate. Sometimes they're close, but not quite right. But there's always something happening that matches what he's trying to tell us. The last time I heard from Harold was 3 months ago, during a blizzard in Wyoming. His transmission was weaker than usual, full of static and hard to understand. But the message was clear. Big Oak, this is Mile High. You got a fuel leak under your trailer. Better pull over and check it before you lose your load, or worse, stay safe out there. Partner. I found a truck stop 10 miles later and discovered a small puncture in one of my fuel lines, probably caused by road debris kicked up by the wind. If I hadn't stopped to fix it, I might have run out of fuel in the middle of nowhere. Or worse, the leak might have caused a fire. I don't know how Harold does it, or why he's still out there watching over drivers 4 years after his death. Maybe some bonds are stronger than whatever separates the living from the dead. Maybe the highway itself holds on to the voices of drivers who spent their lives keeping others safe. Or maybe Harold just can't let go of the road that was his life for so many years. And death is just another kind of breakdown that won't keep him from doing his job. All I know is that when I hear Mile High's voice crackling through my CB speaker, I pay attention. Because Harold Brewster is still looking out for his fellow drivers, even from whatever distant mile marker he's broadcasting from now. My name is Piper, and I work in marketing for a tech company based in Boston. Which means I spend a lot of time traveling to client meetings throughout New England. I'm used to late nights, tight deadlines, and the kind of high-pressure presentations that can make or break million-dollar contracts. What I'm not used to is finding highway exits that shouldn't exist, leading to towns that time forgot, populated by people who seem to think Eisenhower is still president. But that's exactly what happened to me on a rainy October night in 2020, when I took exit 13 off Interstate 495 and drove straight into 1953. I was coming back from a disaster of a meeting in Providence, where I'd spent 3 hours trying to convince a pharmaceutical company to upgrade their digital marketing strategy, only to watch the deal fall apart because their CEO didn't trust any technology developed after the Clinton administration. It was the kind of meeting that makes you question your career choices, especially when you're driving home at 11 p.m. in a rental car with a GPS that keeps losing signal every time you pass under an overpass. The company had booked me a hotel room in Providence, but I hate staying in unfamiliar places when I'm stressed, and my apartment in Cambridge was only an hour away, if traffic cooperated. The rain had started just as I merged onto I-495 north, turning from a light drizzle into a steady downpour that made the highway reflectors blur into long streams of white and yellow light. My windshield wipers were working overtime, and the defroster was barely keeping up with the condensation building up on the inside of the windows. It's the kind of weather that makes you want to slow down and find somewhere safe to wait it out. Stars. But I had an 8 a.m. meeting the next morning with a client who'd made it clear that punctuality was more important to him than politeness or preparedness. I was about 20 miles from my usual exit when I saw the sign for exit 13. It was one of those green highway signs with white lettering. Perfectly normal, except for the fact that I'd never noticed it before despite driving this route at least twice a month for the past 3 years. The exit was marked for Millfield, which wasn't a name I recognized, though there are dozens of small towns scattered throughout Massachusetts that I'd never had reason to visit. What caught my attention was the condition of the sign. It looked brand new, like it had been installed yesterday, with none of the weathering or fading that you'd expect to see on highway infrastructure that's been exposed to New England winters for years. I wasn't planning to take the exit, but as I approached the off-ramp, my GPS suddenly announced that there was an accident ahead on I-495 and that I should take exit 13 to avoid delays. The screen showed a red line indicating heavy traffic for the next 10 miles, which would add at least 40 minutes to my drive home. Taking the detour would only add 15 minutes according to the GPS, routing me through local roads before reconnecting with the interstate further north. It seemed like a reasonable trade-off, especially since I was already running later than I'd planned. The exit ramp curved to the right, leading down into what appeared to be a typical New England valley, with dense forest on both sides and a two-lane road that looked like it had been recently repaved. But as I descended into the valley, I noticed that the streetlights weren't the modern LED fixtures you see everywhere now, but older-style lights with that warm yellow glow that reminds you of old movies. The road signs were different too. Instead of the modern green signs with white lettering, these were black with white text in a font that looked distinctly vintage, like something from the 1950s. The first building I saw was a gas station, and that's when I knew something was seriously wrong. It wasn't just old-fashioned, it was authentically vintage. A white building with red trim, big plate glass windows, and two gas pumps with the old-style glass globes on top that lit up with the company logo. The signs advertised gasoline for 29 cents per gallon, which would have been expensive even in 1953. And there was a banner stretched across the front of the building announcing, "New Premium Ethyl Gasoline." The parking area was filled with cars that belonged in a museum. A powder blue 1951 Chevrolet Bel Air, a cream-colored 1949 Buick Roadmaster, a black 1953 Ford pickup truck with white-wall tires and chrome bumpers that gleamed under the vintage streetlights. My rational mind immediately started looking for logical explanations. Maybe Millfield was one of those tourist towns that capitalize on nostalgia, where the local businesses dress up their storefronts to look like the 1950s and classic car enthusiasts gather for weekend shows. It wouldn't be the first time I'd stumbled across a themed community during my travels through New England, where Revolutionary War reenactments and colonial festivals are as common as Dunkin' Donuts stores. The attention to detail was impressive. Even the fire hydrants were painted to look vintage, and the telephone poles carried old-style glass insulators instead of modern ceramic ones. But as I drove deeper into Millfield's downtown area, the illusion became too complete to be just a tourist attraction. The buildings weren't just decorated to look vintage, they were authentically period-appropriate down to the smallest details. The movie theater was showing From Here to Eternity and Roman Holiday, movies that had been released in 1953, with ticket prices listed as 60 cents for adults and 25 cents for children. The clothing store windows displayed dresses with the full skirts and narrow waists that were fashionable in the early 50s. And the men's shop was advertising new wash and wear shirts as if drip-dry fabric was a revolutionary innovation. The people walking the sidewalks were dressed in period-appropriate clothing, women in dresses that fell below the knee with matching accessories, men in suits with narrow ties and hats that no one had worn unironically since the Eisenhower administration. Their hair was styled in victory rolls and slicked back parts that belonged to a different era entirely. But they weren't acting like costumed performers or weekend hobbyists. They were just going about their business, chatting with neighbors, window shopping, and behaving like normal people who happened to be living in 1953. I pulled into the parking lot of a diner called Mel's, partly because I was genuinely hungry, and partly because I wanted to test how committed this community was to their 1950s theme. The parking lot was filled with more vintage cars, and when I got out of my modern rental sedan, I felt conspicuously out of place. My business suit might have passed for professional attire in any decade, but my smartphone, my modern hairstyle, and my general demeanor clearly marked me as someone who didn't belong in this carefully preserved slice of the past. The inside of the diner was a masterpiece of 1950s design. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floor tiles, a long counter with chrome stools, and a jukebox in the corner playing Patti Page singing, "How Much Is That Doggy in the Window?" The waitress who seated me was wearing a pink uniform with a white apron and a name tag that said Betty. And she spoke with the kind of cheerful, professional courtesy that seemed genuine rather than performed for the benefit of tourists. When I ordered coffee and asked about the menu prices, a complete dinner for $185 seemed too good to be true. Betty looked at me with a puzzled expression and said, "Well, honey, that's what everything costs. Are you feeling all right? You seem a little confused." When I tried to pay with my credit card, she stared at the plastic rectangle like I was trying to hand her a piece of advanced alien technology. "We only take cash or check," she said politely, though she kept glancing at my credit card with obvious bewilderment. I had about $40 in cash, which seemed like a fortune in this economy where coffee cost a dime and a full meal was less than $2. But the strangest part wasn't the prices or the authentic vintage atmosphere. It was the fact that everyone in the diner seemed completely unaware that anything had changed since 1953. The conversations I overheard were about President Eisenhower's policies, the latest episode of I Love Lucy, and whether the local high school football team had a chance against their rivals from the next town over. The newspaper rack by the door was filled with copies of papers dated October 15, 1953, with headlines about the Korean War armistice and Ethel Rosenberg's execution. When I asked Betty about the date, she looked at me like I might be having some kind of medical emergency. "It's Wednesday, October 15th, she said slowly, as if she were talking to someone who'd suffered a head injury. "Are you sure you're feeling all right, honey? Do you need me to call Dr. Morrison?" I tried to explain that I thought it was 2020, that I'd driven here from Providence using a GPS device, that I worked in digital marketing for a tech company. But the words sounded crazy, even to me. Betty nodded sympathetically and suggested that I might want to get some rest, that sometimes traveling and working too hard can make people confused about what year it is. I stayed in that diner for almost 2 hours, trying to make sense of what I was experiencing. The coffee was excellent, the pie was homemade, and the service was friendly. But every detail confirmed that I had somehow stumbled into a pocket of 1953 that had been preserved intact for over 60 years. The other customers paid their bills with coins and dollar bills that looked newly minted but bore dates from the early 50s. The phone booth in the corner had a rotary dial and cost a nickel to use. The radio behind the counter was playing Perry Como and Rosemary Clooney, and when the news came on, it was all about events from 1953. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, the first successful ascent of Mount Everest, the ongoing tests of hydrogen bombs in the Pacific. When I finally worked up the nerve to leave the diner, I discovered that my modern rental car wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, as if something about this place was incompatible with 21st century technology. I was starting to panic, imagining myself trapped forever in this perfectly preserved 1953 community. When Betty came out of the diner and offered to call her husband to take a look at my car. "Harold's real good with automobiles," she said kindly, "though I've never seen one quite like yours before. What make is it?" Harold arrived 20 minutes later in a 1950 Ford pickup truck, wearing coveralls and a baseball cap advertising a motor oil brand that had been discontinued for decades. He spent about 15 minutes looking under the hood of my rental car, making the kind of thoughtful humming sounds that mechanics have been making since the invention of the internal combustion engine. Finally, he straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag. "Well, miss," he said, "I can't rightly figure out what's wrong with this engine. It's got parts I don't recognize and wiring that doesn't make sense to me. Best I can tell you is to try starting it again in the morning. Sometimes these things just need to sit for a while." But I couldn't wait until morning. I had that 8 a.m. meeting, and more importantly, I was starting to feel like this place was trying to keep me here. That if I stayed too long, I might become part of the 1953 population permanently. I tried starting the car again, and this time the engine caught on the first try, settling into the familiar idle of a modern automobile. Harold looked surprised and pleased, as if he'd somehow fixed the problem through the power of positive thinking. I thanked him and Betty for their help, paid for my dinner with money that felt like play money in that economy, and drove back toward what I hoped was still the 21st century. The exit back to I-495 was exactly where I expected it to be, marked with the same vintage-style signs that had guided me into Millfield. But as I climbed the ramp back to the interstate, I could see the town shrinking in my rearview mirror. The warm, yellow streetlights growing dimmer until they disappeared entirely into the darkness. When I reached the top of the ramp and merged back onto I-495, my GPS immediately announced that the traffic delay had been cleared and that I should continue north to my original exit. The next morning, I tried to find Millfield on Google Maps, but there was no town by that name anywhere near exit 13 on I-495. In fact, according to the Massachusetts Highway Department, there is no exit 13 on that stretch of interstate. The exits jump from 12 to 14, skipping 13 entirely. When I called the Highway Department to ask about it, they told me that exit 13 was planned during the original construction in the 1960s, but was canceled due to environmental concerns and budget constraints. The land where it would have been built was eventually turned into a state forest preserve. I've driven that same route dozens of times since then, always looking for exit 13, but I've never seen it again. Sometimes, late at night when it's raining and I'm tired from a long day of meetings, I think I catch a glimpse of those vintage streetlights in my peripheral vision, or I hear what sounds like Perry Como coming through the static on the radio. But when I look directly at the spot where exit 13 should be, there's nothing there but trees and darkness and the normal flow of modern traffic heading home through the Massachusetts night. My name is Daxton, and I'm a mechanic by trade. But my real passion is cars. Building them, racing them, and pushing them to their limits on empty stretches of highway, where the speed limit is more of a suggestion than a law. I've been modifying vehicles since I was 16, turning ordinary cars into extraordinary machines that can outrun most of what Detroit puts on the showroom floor. So when I tell you that I encountered 3 identical black SUVs on Highway 191 through the Utah desert that moved with a precision no human driver could achieve, you'll understand that I know the difference between advanced driving and something that defies the laws of physics entirely. It was September 2017, and I was driving my latest project from Salt Lake City to Denver, a 1967 Mustang Fastback that I'd spent 3 years rebuilding from the ground up. The engine was a custom-built 427 Windsor with a supercharger that could push out over 600 horsepower, backed by a 6-speed manual transmission that I'd adapted from a modern sports car. The suspension was completely reworked with adjustable coilovers, and the brakes were upgraded with racing spec components that could stop the car from 100 miles per hour in less distance than most modern vehicles could manage from 60. It wasn't just a restoration, it was a complete reimagining of what a classic muscle car could be with modern engineering and unlimited attention to detail. I'd chosen Highway 191 because it's one of those roads that car enthusiasts dream about. Long, straight stretches through desert landscape with minimal traffic and excellent visibility for miles in every direction. The speed limit was 80 miles per hour, but the road was designed for much higher speeds. And on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of nowhere, there was no reason not to test what 3 years of work had produced. The Mustang ran like a dream, the supercharger whining softly as I pushed the car through its gears, the engine note echoing off the canyon walls that rose on both sides of the highway. I was cruising at a comfortable 95 miles per hour, enjoying the way the car handled the gentle curves and elevation changes, when I first noticed them in my rearview mirror. 3 black SUVs, identical in every detail I could make out, traveling in a perfect triangular formation about a quarter mile behind me. They matched my speed exactly, maintaining that precise distance and formation as if they were connected by invisible cables. At first, I assumed it was some kind of government convoy or corporate security detail. The vehicles looked expensive and professional, the kind of black Suburbans or Escalades that federal agencies use for transporting officials through remote areas. But as the miles passed, their behavior became increasingly unnatural. When I sped up to test my car's acceleration, pushing it to 110 miles per hour, they accelerated smoothly to match my speed, never falling behind or getting closer. When I slowed down to 75 to see if they would pass, they slowed down too, maintaining that same quarter-mile distance with mechanical precision. Most unsettling was their formation. The lead vehicle stayed centered in my lane behind me, while the other 2 maintained perfect positions in the left and right lanes, creating an equilateral triangle that never varied despite the curves and elevation changes in the highway. I've done enough track driving and autocross events to recognize skilled driving when I see it. And this was beyond skill. This was the kind of precision you'd expect from computer-controlled vehicles. Except that autonomous driving technology in 2017 was nowhere near advanced enough to maintain perfect formation at highway speeds through varying terrain. The movements were too coordinated, too exact, like watching a choreographed performance rather than 3 separate drivers making independent decisions about speed and lane position. My first thought was that I'd somehow attracted the attention of law enforcement, maybe DEA agents who suspected my modified Mustang was being used for drug running. The desert highways of Utah are known corridors for smuggling operations, and a heavily modified muscle car traveling at high speed could certainly draw suspicious attention from federal agents. I slowed down to exactly the speed limit and activated my turn signal to indicate that I was looking for a place to pull over, thinking that if these were federal agents, the professional thing to do would be to stop and answer whatever questions they had about my vehicle and my travel plans. But when I pulled off at a rest area near mile marker 85, the 3 SUVs continued past without slowing down, maintaining their triangular formation and disappearing around a curve in the highway. I sat in the parking area for about 10 minutes, giving them plenty of time to get well ahead of me, then pulled back onto the highway and resumed my drive toward Colorado. For the next 20 miles, I saw no sign of the black SUVs, and I began to think that their presence behind me had been nothing more than coincidence. 3 vehicles traveling in the same direction at roughly the same speed, with drivers who happened to be maintaining safe following distances. But then they were back, not gradually approaching from behind or catching up after I'd passed them, but simply there in my rearview mirror, maintaining that same quarter-mile distance in the same perfect triangular formation. It was like they had materialized out of thin air, resuming their pursuit without any transition or approach phase. I checked my speedometer to make sure I wasn't going faster than I thought. I was doing exactly 80 miles per hour, right at the speed limit. But the SUVs matched my speed with that same mechanical precision, never varying their distance or formation. This time, I decided to test them more aggressively. I downshifted to 4th gear and floored the accelerator, pushing the Mustang well into triple-digit speeds as the supercharger whined and the engine roared. The desert highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of black asphalt, and my car responded with the kind of acceleration that only comes from serious horsepower and expert tuning. I watched the speedometer climb past 120, past 130, approaching 140 miles per hour as the landscape blurred past in my peripheral vision. The black SUVs kept pace effortlessly. Not only did they match my acceleration, they maintained their precise formation, even at speeds that should have been impossible for heavy, high-profile vehicles on a highway with crosswinds and elevation changes. SUVs aren't built for high-speed stability. Their high center of gravity and aerodynamic brick shape make them difficult to control much above 100 miles per hour, especially in formation driving, where any mistake by one driver could cause a multi-vehicle accident. But these three vehicles moved like they were on rails, unaffected by physics or aerodynamics or any of the factors that normally limit vehicle performance. I tried every evasive maneuver I could think of. Sudden lane changes, rapid acceleration and deceleration, taking exit ramps at the last second, and then immediately getting back on the highway. The SUVs matched every move with perfect timing and coordination, never breaking formation, never falling behind, never getting close enough for me to make out details about the drivers or license plates. It was like being followed by remote-controlled vehicles operated by someone with perfect information about my intentions and perfect control over their responses. The most unnerving part was the absolute silence. My Mustang was loud. The exhaust note was designed to announce the car's presence from a mile away. And at high speeds, the supercharger and intake noise were unmistakable. But I never heard any sound from the pursuing SUVs. No engine noise, no tire noise, nothing that would indicate three large vehicles traveling at high speed across desert pavement. When I rolled down my windows to listen, all I could hear was my own engine and the wind, as if the black SUVs were somehow moving through the air without displacing it or making contact with the road surface. After 2 hours of this cat-and-mouse game, I was getting genuinely scared. Whatever these vehicles were, they weren't operated by human drivers using conventional technology. The precision was too perfect, the coordination too exact, the performance capabilities too far beyond what should have been possible for SUVs of any kind. I started looking for populated areas where I could seek help. But Highway 191 through that part of Utah is one of the most remote stretches of road in the continental United States, with services spaced 50 miles apart and cell phone coverage spotty at best. That's when I decided to try something desperate. There was a scenic overlook coming up, a paved area carved into the side of a mesa that offered panoramic views of the desert valley below. Instead of using my turn signal and giving the SUVs advance notice of my intentions, I waited until the last possible second and then yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, using the Mustang's upgraded brakes and suspension to make a turn that would have been impossible for any stock vehicle. The car slid sideways through the entrance to the overlook, tires screaming against the pavement as the anti-lock brakes fought to maintain traction. I came to a stop facing back toward the highway, expecting to see the three SUVs continuing past or maybe turning around to follow me into the overlook. But there was nothing there. The highway was completely empty, stretching away in both directions without any sign of the vehicles that had been following me for over 2 hours. Not only were they gone, but there was no sign that they had ever been there. No dust clouds from hard braking, no tire marks from sudden maneuvers, no distant headlights disappearing over the horizon. I sat in that overlook for almost an hour, watching the highway and trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. A few normal vehicles passed, a pickup truck, a minivan, a semi-trailer hauling cattle, but no black SUVs. When I finally worked up the courage to continue my drive to Denver, I kept checking my rearview mirror constantly, but the mysterious convoy never reappeared. The rest of the drive was completely normal, just me and my Mustang cruising through the desert under a sky full of stars. Later, back home in my garage, I started researching Highway 191 and found some interesting information. In 1983, a government convoy of 3 vehicles had crashed in that exact area during a classified transport mission, according to the declassified accident report I found through a Freedom of Information Act request. The convoy consisted of 3 identical black SUVs, carrying sensitive materials from a research facility in Utah to a storage site in Colorado. Weather conditions were clear, visibility was excellent, and there was no apparent cause for the accident. But all 3 vehicles left the highway simultaneously at high speed and rolled down an embankment, killing all occupants and destroying whatever they were transporting. The official investigation concluded that the lead driver had suffered some kind of medical emergency, causing the following vehicles to react by swerving to avoid a collision. But the physics didn't make sense. For all 3 vehicles to leave the highway at exactly the same point and follow identical trajectories down the embankment suggested a level of coordination that would be impossible if the drivers were reacting to an unexpected emergency. It was more like they had been programmed to crash at that specific location, which made no sense given the technology available in 1983. What made the story even stranger was that local residents reported seeing the convoy continuing to travel Highway 191 for months after the accident, always at night, always in perfect formation, always disappearing when anyone tried to approach or follow them. The sightings became so frequent that the State Highway Patrol investigated, but they never found any evidence of the phantom vehicles. Eventually, the report stopped, and the incident was forgotten except for a few conspiracy theorists who believed the convoy was carrying alien technology or secret weapons that somehow continued to operate even after their human operators were dead. I've driven Highway 191 several times since then, always during daylight hours, and I've never seen the black SUVs again. But I've talked to other drivers who've had similar experiences. 3 identical vehicles following them through the desert with inhuman precision, matching their every move until they reached the exact spot where the original convoy crashed, then vanishing without explanation. Some think it's a residual haunting, the echo of a tragedy playing out over and over again. Others believe it's some kind of experimental military technology that became autonomous after the crash, continuing to patrol the highway according to its original programming. I think those 3 SUVs are still out there, following orders from 1983, carrying out a mission that ended 40 years ago, but somehow continues in a loop that death couldn't break. And sometimes, when conditions are right and a driver catches their attention, they resume their formation and follow, maintaining perfect distance and coordination until they reach the place where their original mission ended, in twisted metal and classified secrets scattered across the Utah desert. My name is Valeria, and I'm a real estate agent in Charlotte, North Carolina, which means I spend a lot of time driving mountain highways to show properties in remote locations that wealthy clients want for weekend retreats or retirement homes. I've been selling real estate for 18 years, and I pride myself on my professionalism, my punctuality, and my ability to handle any situation that might arise during a showing or negotiation. What I'm not prepared for is supernatural intervention on dark mountain roads. But that's exactly what happened to me in November 2019, when a dead highway worker saved my life and the lives of my 2 sleeping children on a winding stretch of Highway 9 that locals call Dead Man's Curve. It was a Thursday night, and I was driving home from a disaster of a showing in the mountains near Black Mountain. The clients were from New York, looking for a rustic mountain retreat, but expecting Manhattan amenities at rural prices. After 4 hours of showing them properties that were either too primitive or too expensive, they decided that North Carolina wasn't what they were looking for after all, leaving me with wasted time, wasted gas, and the frustrating realization that some people have no realistic understanding of what their budget can actually buy in the mountains. My kids were with me because it was parent-teacher conference day at their school, and I hadn't been able to arrange childcare on short notice. Emma was 7 and Marcus was 9, both exhausted from a long day of waiting in real estate offices while their mom tried to make a living. They'd fallen asleep in the back of my minivan before we even left the mountain property, curled up under the blankets I always kept in the car for situations like this. The drive home normally took about an hour and a half, mostly on winding mountain highways that required careful attention even during the day. But this wasn't a normal night. A cold front was moving through the region, bringing freezing rain that turned the mountain roads into skating rinks. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the last hour, and what had started as regular rain was now coating everything with a thin layer of ice that made even gentle curves treacherous. I was driving well below the speed limit, following the reflective lane markers that were the only things visible through the freezing rain. When I reached the section of Highway 9 that's notorious for accidents. Dead Man's Curve isn't the official name. The highway department calls it the S-curves at mile marker 47. But everyone who lives in the area knows what you mean when you use the local terminology. It's a series of sharp turns that wind around the side of a mountain, with a steep drop-off on one side and a rock wall on the other. The curves are banked wrong for the speed limit, and there's no shoulder to speak of. Just a guardrail that's been rebuilt so many times, it looks like a patchwork quilt of different metals and mounting systems. On a clear day with dry pavement, it requires careful attention from experienced mountain drivers. On a night with freezing rain and near zero visibility, it becomes a death trap that claims several lives every year. I was approaching the first curve, doing maybe 25 miles per hour in a 35 zone, when I saw the figure standing in the road ahead. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, the way headlights and rain and fog can create shapes that aren't really there. But as I got closer, I could see it was definitely a person. A man in an orange reflective vest and hard hat, holding what looked like a stop sign on a long pole. He was positioned right in the center of my lane, clearly indicating that I should come to a complete stop, which seemed strange because there was no construction equipment visible and no signs of any road work in progress. I came to a stop about 20 feet in front of him, rolling down my window despite the freezing rain to ask what was going on. "Is there an accident ahead?" I called out, but he didn't respond. He just stood there holding the stop sign, as still as a statue, while the freezing rain bounced off his reflective vest without seeming to affect him at all. After sitting there for maybe 3 minutes, wondering if he was waiting for some kind of signal from other workers, I tried again. "Sir, is the road blocked? How long do I need to wait?" That's when he began to move, stepping to the side of the road and waving his arm in a proceed slowly gesture that any driver would recognize as a signal to continue forward but remain cautious. I thanked him through my open window, though I'm not sure he could hear me over the sound of the freezing rain hitting the pavement, and began to ease forward into the first curve. But as soon as I started moving, he reappeared in my headlights, this time further ahead, again holding the stop sign and blocking my path. This pattern continued for the next 10 minutes. He would stop me, make me wait, then wave me forward to the next curve, where he would appear again as if he were somehow moving ahead of my vehicle faster than I was driving. At first, I assumed he was part of a road crew working to keep the highway safe during the ice storm, maybe positioning himself at each dangerous curve to control traffic and prevent accidents. It made sense. Highway 9 through that area is maintained by the county, and they have crews that work around the clock during severe weather events to keep the roads passable and respond to emergencies. The man's equipment looked professional. His reflective vest and hard hat were regulation safety gear, and his hand signals were textbook perfect, exactly what you'd expect from an experienced highway worker who'd spent years directing traffic around construction zones and accident scenes. But there were details that didn't make sense. I never saw any county vehicles, no maintenance trucks or snow plows or any of the equipment that road crews use during ice storms. There were no flares or cones or temporary signs indicating that road work was in progress. Most importantly, the man never seemed to get wet despite the freezing rain that was coating my windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. His reflective vest remained perfectly clean and bright, and he moved with the kind of steady, unhurried precision that seemed unnatural for someone working in dangerous weather conditions on a treacherous mountain road. The strangest part was his timing. Each time he stopped me, it was just before a curve where the ice was particularly bad, where the combination of the banking and the slope and the weather conditions created a perfect storm of factors that could send a vehicle sliding off the road and down the mountainside. And each time he let me proceed. It was after giving me just enough time to let my speed drop to almost nothing, ensuring that I would navigate the curve safely, even with minimal traction. It was like he had perfect knowledge of exactly where the road was most dangerous, and exactly how long I needed to wait for conditions to improve just enough to make it through safely. After about 20 minutes of this stop-and-go progress through Dead Man's Curve, I finally reached the straight section on the other side where the road leveled out and the ice wasn't as much of a problem. I expected to see the highway worker one more time, maybe to thank him for his help and ask about road conditions ahead. But when I looked for him in my rearview mirror, he was nowhere to be seen. The entire stretch of road behind me was empty, with no sign of the man who had just spent 20 minutes guiding me through the most dangerous part of my drive home. I didn't think much about it at the time. I was focused on getting my sleeping children home safely, and I assumed the worker had simply returned to his vehicle or moved on to help other drivers who might be struggling with the ice storm. It wasn't until the next morning, when I was reading the local news online, that I learned the full story of what had happened on Highway 9 the night before. According to the Charlotte Observer, there had been no county road crews working on Highway 9 during the ice storm. The weather had been too severe for safe operation of maintenance equipment, and all non-emergency road work had been suspended until conditions improved. More disturbing was the report of what had happened to other drivers who had attempted to navigate Dead Man's Curve around the same time I had. 3 vehicles had slid off the road in the early hours of the morning, including a pickup truck that had gone over the guardrail and rolled down the mountainside, killing the driver instantly. A state trooper quoted in the article said that the ice conditions were the worst he'd seen in 20 years, and that anyone who had successfully navigated that section of highway during the storm had been extremely lucky or extremely careful. But I knew it hadn't been luck that got me through safely. Someone had been there, controlling my speed and timing, making sure I approached each curve at exactly the right moment and exactly the right speed to maintain traction on the ice. I started researching the history of Dead Man's Curve, looking for any information that might explain who the highway worker could have been and why he had been there to help me when the county hadn't sent any crews out in the storm. What I found in the local newspaper archives made my blood run cold. In 2014, exactly 5 years before my encounter, a highway worker named James Mitchell had been killed while directing traffic around an accident scene at mile marker 47, the exact location where I'd first seen the man in the reflective vest. According to the accident report, James had been working late shift maintenance when he'd responded to a multi-vehicle accident caused by freezing rain. While setting up safety barriers to protect the wreckage, he'd been struck by a vehicle that lost control on the icy pavement and slid through the work zone. He was 43 years old, married with 2 young children, and had been working for the county highway department for 16 years. The newspaper had included a photograph of James with the obituary, and when I saw his face, I knew immediately that he was the man who had guided me through Dead Man's Curve. Same build, same facial features, same careful professional demeanor that had impressed me even through the freezing rain and darkness. But James Mitchell had been dead for 5 years, killed at the exact location where he'd appeared to help me navigate safely through conditions that were nearly identical to those that had claimed his life. Over the next few weeks, I started asking around among other real estate agents who regularly drive Highway 9, and I discovered that my experience wasn't unique. Several people had encountered a helpful highway worker at Dead Man's Curve during severe weather conditions, always at night, always during situations where the road was particularly dangerous due to ice or fog or rain. The descriptions were always consistent. A middle-aged man in county safety gear, professional and competent, who would appear just long enough to guide drivers safely through the curves and then disappear without explanation. One agent told me that James Mitchell had been known throughout the highway department as someone who took his job seriously, who genuinely cared about keeping travelers safe on dangerous mountain roads. If anyone was going to stick around after death to help people, she said, it would be James. He always said that every driver who made it home safely was a victory, and every accident was a personal failure. Maybe he's still out there, still trying to get that perfect safety record. I've driven Highway 9 dozens of times since that night, always during daylight hours when the weather is clear, and I've never seen James Mitchell again. But I've heard from other parents, other real estate agents, other people with children in their cars who've encountered him during dangerous conditions on Dead Man's Curve. He's always the same, professional, helpful, appearing just long enough to guide them safely through the most treacherous part of their journey, then disappearing back into whatever realm highway workers go to when their shift is finally over. I don't know if James Mitchell knows that he's dead, or if he's consciously choosing to continue his work from beyond the grave. All I know is that on a night when 3 other drivers lost their lives on the same stretch of road, a dead highway worker made sure that my children and I made it home safely, continuing to protect travelers on a curve that claimed his life 5 years ago and continues to claim lives today. And sometimes, when I'm driving through the mountains late at night with my family, I find myself hoping that if we ever encounter dangerous conditions again, James Mitchell will be there in his reflective vest and hard hat, making sure that every parent gets their children home safe. My name is Tadeo, and I work as a delivery driver for a regional logistics company that specializes in overnight shipping between Arizona and Colorado. It's not glamorous work, but it pays well enough to support my family. And I actually enjoy the solitude of long-distance driving, the way the highway stretches out ahead of you like a ribbon of possibility under the desert stars. I've been running this route for 3 years, and I thought I knew every mile of Interstate 40 between Phoenix and Denver, every truck stop and rest area and scenic overlook. But in February 2022, somewhere in the vast emptiness between Flagstaff and Gallup, my radio picked up a station that shouldn't exist, broadcasting from 1947 with a DJ who knew things about my life that no living person should know. The run started normally enough. I'd picked up a load of electronics from a distribution center in Phoenix, high-value stuff that needed to be in Denver by 6 a.m. for a corporate presentation that couldn't be delayed. The weight was good. The trailer was properly secured, and the weather forecast called for clear skies all the way across Arizona and into New Mexico. I'd made this exact run dozens of times before, and barring any mechanical problems or unexpected road construction, I could make the delivery with time to spare and still get home to my wife and daughter by dinner time. I left Phoenix just after sunset, which meant I'd be driving through the night across some of the most remote and beautiful country in the American Southwest. The desert takes on a different character after dark. What looks harsh and forbidding during the day becomes mysterious and almost magical under the stars. With distant mountains silhouetted against the sky like sleeping giants, and the highway stretching ahead like a pathway to somewhere beyond the edge of the world. I've always found night driving relaxing, especially on routes like this where traffic is light and you can cruise at a steady speed without constantly dealing with slower vehicles or aggressive drivers. About 2 hours into the drive, somewhere between Flagstaff and Winslow, I started scanning through radio stations to find something to keep me company through the long desert miles ahead. AM radio travels farther at night because of atmospheric conditions, and you can sometimes pick up stations from hundreds of miles away. Broadcasts from cities you've never visited, carrying voices and music across the empty spaces between. I was looking for news or talk radio, something to help me stay alert during the monotonous stretches where the highway runs straight as an arrow for 50 miles at a time. That's when I found KDES 1340 on the AM dial, broadcasting from what the station identification announced as the high desert of Arizona, bringing you the finest in popular music and entertainment. The signal was crystal clear, none of the static or fading you usually get from distant stations. And the music was immediately familiar. Big band jazz from the 1940s, the kind of swing music my grandfather used to play when I was a kid. Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, Benny Goodman, all the giants of the swing era, playing their most famous arrangements with that warm, rich sound that only comes from analog recording equipment and musicians who learned their craft in the dance halls and ballrooms of the war years. The DJ had a smooth, professional voice with a kind of mid-Atlantic accent that radio announcers cultivated in the 1940s, when broadcasting was still considered a prestigious profession that required perfect diction and impeccable timing. He called himself Johnny Midnight, and he spoke between songs with the easy confidence of someone who'd been working in radio for years, sharing bits of music history and gentle humor that felt genuine rather than scripted. That was Glenn Miller and his orchestra with Moonlight Serenade, recorded live at the Glen Island Casino back in 1939, he said after one song ended. Hard to believe that was 8 years ago now, but time has a way of slipping past when you're not paying attention. 8 years ago from 1939 would put the broadcast in 1947, which seemed like an odd way for a modern DJ to frame a historical recording. But I figured it was just part of the station's vintage theme. There are plenty of specialty stations that focus on music from specific eras, and some of them go to great lengths to create an authentic period atmosphere, complete with DJs who speak in period-appropriate language and reference contemporary events from the era they're celebrating. It was entertaining and educational, exactly the kind of programming that makes long-distance driving more enjoyable. But as the night wore on, Johnny Midnight's commentary became increasingly specific to 1947. Not just in terms of the music he was playing, but in references to current events and social conditions that went far beyond what any theme show would attempt. He talked about President Truman's struggles with the Republican Congress, about the ongoing housing shortage as servicemen returned from the war, about the rising tensions with the Soviet Union that everyone hoped wouldn't lead to another conflict. He mentioned movie stars and politicians and sports figures as if they were contemporary celebrities rather than historical figures. And he discussed technological innovations like television and jet aircraft as exciting new developments rather than established parts of modern life. When he started taking requests from listeners, I decided to test whether this was really an elaborate historical reenactment or something stranger. I don't have a CB radio in my delivery truck, but I do have a cell phone, and the station had given out a phone number for listeners who wanted to request songs or share dedications. I called the number expecting either to get a busy signal or to reach some kind of automated system that would maintain the 1947 illusion. But Johnny Midnight answered personally on the second ring. "KDES, you're on the air with Johnny Midnight," he said, his voice exactly the same as it sounded through the radio. "What can I play for you tonight, friend?" I asked him to play something by Nat King Cole, thinking that would be a safe request that would fit with the station's format. But his response caught me completely off guard. "Nat King Cole, excellent choice," he said. "I've got his new recording of the Christmas song right here, just came in from Capitol Records last week. Beautiful arrangement, though I have to say it's a little unusual to be playing Christmas music in February. Special occasion, Tadeo?" He'd used my name. I hadn't told him my name during our brief conversation, and there was no way he could have known it from caller ID or any other technological source, especially if he was really broadcasting from 1947. But somehow Johnny Midnight knew exactly who was calling, and he pronounced my name perfectly, with the correct Spanish pronunciation that most English speakers get wrong. I was so surprised that I just mumbled something about liking Christmas music year-round and hung up. But a few minutes later, Nat King Cole's voice filled my truck cab with the Christmas song, performed with the intimate, conversational style that made him one of the greatest interpreters of American popular song. That was for Tadeo, driving through the desert tonight with a truck full of electronics bound for Colorado, Johnny Midnight announced after the song ended. "Safe travels, friend, and give my regards to your wife Maria and your little girl Sophia when you get home. They're lucky to have a man who works so hard to provide for his family." My blood ran cold. I'd never mentioned my wife and daughter to anyone at the radio station, and I certainly hadn't told Johnny Midnight their names during our brief phone conversation. But somehow, he knew not just their names, but details about my life that only someone who knew me personally would know. And over the next 100 miles, Johnny Midnight continued to demonstrate impossible knowledge about my life, my family, and my circumstances. He played songs that had special meaning for Maria and me. "La vida es un sueño" by Benny Moré, which had been playing when we first danced together at her cousin's wedding, and "Bésame mucho" by Consuelo Velázquez, which Maria used to sing to Sophia when she was a baby. Between songs, he shared memories and observations that seemed to come from someone who had been present at important moments in my life. Someone who knew my hopes and fears and dreams in a way that felt both comforting and deeply unsettling. "You know, Tadeo," he said during one break between songs, "I've been thinking about what you told me last year about wanting to start your own trucking company. That's a big dream, friend, and it's going to take courage and determination to make it happen. But I believe in you, and I think your father would be proud of the man you've become, even if he never got to see you succeed in the way you're going to succeed. My father had died when I was 15, and I'd never spoken to anyone at KDES about my business plans or my relationship with my father, but Johnny Midnight spoke about these things as if we were old friends, as if we'd had many conversations over the years about my ambitions and my family history. The most unsettling moment came around 3 in the morning, as I was crossing into New Mexico and beginning the long climb through the mountains toward Gallup. Johnny Midnight had just finished playing a Tommy Dorsey arrangement of "I'll Never Smile Again" when he addressed me directly, without any prompting or phone call on my part. "Tadeo, I know you're wondering how I know so much about your life," he said, his voice carrying a note of sadness that hadn't been there earlier in the broadcast. "The truth is, I've been watching over your family for a long time, ever since your grandfather Miguel used to listen to KDES during his own long nights on the road back in the 1940s. My grandfather Miguel had been a truck driver, but he died before I was born. And I'd never heard any family stories about him listening to specific radio stations during his runs. But Johnny Midnight continued as if he were sharing memories of someone he'd known personally. Miguel was a good man. Just like you, Tadeo. He used to call in requests for your grandmother Elena, especially on nights when he was missing home and needed to hear something that reminded him of the love he was working so hard to provide for. He had the same dreams you have. Wanting to build something lasting for his family, wanting to be remembered as a man who did right by the people he loved. The pieces were starting to come together in a way that made no rational sense, but felt emotionally true. My grandfather had died in a trucking accident in 1952, somewhere on a desert highway in Arizona, while hauling freight between Phoenix and Albuquerque. The family had never gotten many details about the accident, just that he'd apparently fallen asleep at the wheel during a night run and crashed into a bridge abutment. But now, Johnny Midnight was suggesting that my grandfather had been a regular listener to KDS, that there was some kind of connection between my family and this mysterious radio station that seemed to exist outside of normal time. I want you to know that Miguel is proud of you. Johnny Midnight continued, his voice now clearly addressing me as if I were sitting in the studio with him rather than driving through the New Mexico mountains. He's proud of the way you've carried on the family tradition of working hard and providing for the people you love. And he wants you to know that the dreams you're afraid to pursue are the same dreams he had for you before you were even born. Don't let fear keep you from building the business you've been planning, Tadeo. The road ahead is going to be challenging, but it's also going to lead you to the success your family deserves. By the time I reached Gallup, the sun was beginning to rise over the eastern mountains, and Johnny Midnight was signing off for the night. This is KDS, the voice of the high desert, saying goodbye until tomorrow evening, he said, his voice beginning to fade as if the signal was weakening with the approaching dawn. Remember, friends, the road may be long and sometimes lonely, but you're never really alone as long as you carry the love of your family in your heart. Safe travels, everyone, and keep your dial tuned to 1340 for the finest in music and companionship through the desert night. I tried to find KDES again on subsequent runs, scanning through the AM dial during the hours when I'd first encountered the station. But 1340 carried only static or distant signals from conventional radio stations playing modern music. Internet searches turned up no reference to KD's or Johnny Midnight, and when I contacted the FCC to ask about historical broadcasting licenses in Arizona, they had no record of any station using those call letters or broadcasting on 1340 AM from the high desert region. But the impact of that night stayed with me. 6 months later, I used my savings to make a down payment on my own truck. And within a year, I'd started the small trucking company I'd been dreaming about for so long. Maria and Sophia are proud of what we've built together. And sometimes, during long desert nights, when I'm running loads across the Southwest, I think I can hear the faint echo of Johnny Midnight's voice carried on the wind, still watching over drivers like my grandfather Miguel, still playing the music that connects us across the years to the people we love, and the dreams that keep us moving forward through the darkness toward whatever waits beyond the horizon. My name is Arya, and I'm an emergency room physician at UCSF Medical Center in San Francisco, which means I'm trained to stay calm under pressure, think logically during crises, and approach unusual situations with scientific skepticism. I've seen things in the ER that would shake most people's faith in the natural order of the world. Unexplained recoveries, mysterious injuries, cases where modern medicine collides with forces we don't fully understand. But nothing in my medical training prepared me for what happened to me in October 2020. Driving home from a medical conference through the fog-covered hills of Northern California. when I took a detour that led me through towns that had been destroyed by earthquakes decades before I was born. The conference had been in Monterey, 3 days of presentations on emergency trauma protocols that should have been routine continuing education, but had turned into a frustrating exercise in medical politics and pharmaceutical marketing. I'd flown down from San Francisco on Thursday, planning to drive the scenic coastal route home on Sunday afternoon. But fog had rolled in from the Pacific so thick that Highway 1 was basically undrivable. The rental car company had given me a white Lexus sedan with GPS navigation, and the system was insisting that the fastest route back to San Francisco was inland through the mountains, even though that meant giving up the beautiful ocean views I'd been looking forward to. I left Monterey around 4 p.m., thinking I'd be home by 7 or 8. But the fog followed me inland, turning what should have been a pleasant drive through wine country into a nerve-wracking crawl through near-zero visibility. The GPS kept recalculating my route as traffic conditions changed, routing me onto smaller and smaller roads as it tried to find the fastest way around accidents and construction delays caused by the weather. By 6 p.m., I was completely lost in the hills east of Salinas, following a winding 2-lane road that didn't appear on any of the paper maps I kept in the car, trusting electronic navigation to guide me home. That's when the GPS announced that there was a major accident ahead blocking my route, and that I should take the next right to follow a detour that would add only 15 minutes to my trip. The detour led through what the navigation system identified as the towns of San Benito, Esperanza, and Valle Verde. Names that sounded authentically Californian, but weren't familiar to me, despite having lived in the Bay Area for 8 years. The road was well maintained and properly marked, with reflective signs indicating speed limits and direction changes. But something about the landscape felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. The fog began to lift as I descended into the first valley, revealing a town that looked like it had been preserved in amber since the 1950s. San Benito consisted of maybe 24 buildings arranged along a single main street: a post office, a general store, a gas station, a small cafe, and several houses with carefully maintained gardens and white picket fences. The architecture was distinctly mid-century. All clean lines and large windows, and everything was painted in the kind of bright, optimistic colors that were popular in the immediate post-war years. There were no modern vehicles visible anywhere. Just a few cars parked along the street that looked like they belonged in a classic car show. I stopped at the gas station, thinking I should fuel up before continuing the drive home. But the attendant who came out to help me was dressed in a uniform that looked like it came from the Eisenhower era. Pressed khakis, a white shirt with the company logo embroidered on the pocket, and a cap that sat at precisely the right angle. He was maybe 60 years old, with the kind of meticulous grooming that men of his generation took seriously, and he spoke with the formal courtesy that had been standard in the service industry before everything became casual and hurried. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, tipping his cap. "Fill it up with regular?" The price displayed on the pump was 98 cents per gallon, which seemed impossibly low, even accounting for the remote location. But I figured maybe it was some kind of promotional pricing or the rural equivalent of a loss leader designed to attract customers to buy other items in the store. I paid with my credit card, though the attendant looked puzzled by the chip reader and had to swipe it the old-fashioned way, explaining that their electronic systems were still pretty new and sometimes had trouble with cards from out of state. The next town, Esperanza, was larger but maintained the same mid-century aesthetic. The main street was lined with shops that could have been transplanted directly from 1955. A 5-and-dime store with window displays of household goods and children's toys. A drugstore with a soda fountain visible through the front window. A movie theater showing films I'd never heard of, but which were advertised as new releases. The people walking the sidewalks were dressed in period-appropriate clothing and moved with the unhurried pace of small-town life, stopping to chat with neighbors and window shop in a way that seemed genuinely relaxed rather than performed for the benefit of tourists. I was beginning to suspect that I'd stumbled into some kind of historical preservation area or living museum, the kind of place where entire communities maintain period authenticity as a tourist attraction. California has several such areas, particularly in the Gold Country and along the coast, where towns have turned their history into their primary economic asset. But there were no signs indicating that this was a historical site. No admission fees or tour guides or gift shops selling postcards and souvenirs. Everyone I encountered seemed to be going about their normal daily business, and they treated my presence as unremarkable despite the fact that my modern clothing and car should have made me stand out like a time traveler. Valle Verde was the largest of the three towns, with what appeared to be a small downtown area complete with a courthouse, a bank, several restaurants, and a hotel that advertised rooms for $8 per night. I stopped at a cafe called the Golden State Restaurant, partly because I was getting hungry and partly because I wanted to test how committed these communities were to their historical theme. The menu was typed on paper that looked authentically aged, with prices that reflected 1950s economics. Complete dinners for under $2, coffee for 15 cents, pie for 30 cents a slice. The waitress who seated me was wearing a pink uniform with a white apron and spoke with the kind of cheerful professionalism that seemed genuine rather than scripted. When I ordered coffee and asked about the town's history, she spoke about local events and personalities as if they were current news rather than historical facts. She mentioned the new interstate highway system that was supposed to connect California's major cities, the ongoing construction of suburban housing developments to accommodate all the veterans returning from the war, and the exciting technological developments that were changing American life. Television, modern appliances, jet aircraft that could cross the country in hours instead of days. I spent almost 2 hours in that cafe, talking with the waitress and other customers about their lives and their community. And everyone I met spoke about the world as if it were 1955. They discussed President Eisenhower's policies, the latest Hollywood movies, the growing tensions with the Soviet Union, and local concerns about whether the new interstate highways would bring more visitors or just make it easier for young people to leave for opportunities in larger cities. None of them seemed to recognize references to more recent events or technologies. And when I tried to pay with a credit card, they looked at the plastic rectangle with the same puzzled expression I'd gotten at the gas station. As I prepared to leave Valle Verde and continue my drive home, I realized that I'd forgotten to check the time on my phone for several hours. When I looked at the screen, I was shocked to discover that it was nearly midnight. I'd somehow lost 4 hours in the three towns, though it had felt like maybe an hour and a half at most. More disturbing, my phone showed no signal bars and a battery level that was dropping rapidly despite having been fully charged when I'd left Monterey. The GPS was still working, showing my location and plotting a route back to San Francisco. But the map display looked wrong somehow, with roads and landmarks that didn't match what I remembered from previous trips through the area. The drive home took less time than it should have, as if the distance between Valle Verde and San Francisco had somehow compressed while I was exploring the three towns. I found myself back on familiar highways without any clear memory of how I'd gotten there. And when I reached my apartment in the Mission District, the clock on my dashboard showed that it was only 9:30 p.m., despite my phone insisting that I'd been gone for over 8 hours. I went to bed thinking that the fog and the long conference weekend had left me more disoriented than I'd realized. That fatigue and stress had caused me to misperceive time and distance in a way that had created a false memory of visiting towns that probably didn't exist. But the next morning, when I checked the photos I'd taken with my phone during my stop in Valle Verde, I found images that couldn't be explained by any rational understanding of time or geography. The pictures showed the cafe, the main street, the people I'd met, all exactly as I remembered them. But as I watched, the images began to change. Colors fading and details disappearing until they showed only empty lots and foundations overgrown with weeds, as if the buildings and people had never existed at all. I spent the following weekend researching the area where I'd encountered the 3 towns, using geological survey maps and historical records to try to understand what I'd experienced. What I found in the California State Archives made my hands shake as I read. San Benito, Esperanza, and Valle Verde had been real towns, thriving communities in the Gabilan Mountains east of Salinas. But they'd all been destroyed in the same earthquake in March 1957, a 6.2 magnitude tremor that had caused massive landslides and completely erased the 3 towns from the map. According to the newspaper reports from the time, 847 people had died in the disaster, and the survivors had been relocated to other communities rather than attempting to rebuild in such a geologically unstable area. The most unsettling detail in the historical record was a collection of photographs taken in Valle Verde just weeks before the earthquake. Images that showed the town exactly as I remembered it. The same buildings, the same street layout, even some of the same faces I'd seen in the Golden State restaurant. The photos were dated February 1957, and according to the caption, they'd been taken by a traveling photographer who was documenting small California towns for a book that was never published because of his death in the earthquake. I've driven through that area several times since then, always during daylight hours, and I've never found any trace of the 3 towns. The roads I remember taking don't appear on any map, and the valleys where San Benito, Esperanza, and Valle Verde once stood are now protected wilderness areas where development has been prohibited since the 1960s. But sometimes, when fog rolls in from the Pacific and visibility drops to near zero, I wonder if those towns are still there, still living out their final weeks before the earthquake, still welcoming travelers who take the wrong turn and find themselves visiting places that time forgot. The photos on my phone have completely faded now, leaving only blank files with corrupted data that my computer can't read. But I still have the receipt from the Golden State restaurant, printed on paper that's yellowing with age and showing a date from February 15, 1957, just 3 weeks before the earthquake that erased Valle Verde from the world. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, wondering if I really visited those towns or if the receipt is just a souvenir from a past that never was. Evidence of a detour that led not through space, but through time, to a place where people were still living their normal lives in the final moments before everything changed forever. My name is Sage, and I work as an insurance investigator for a large firm that specializes in suspicious claims and potential fraud cases. It's the kind of job that requires you to be naturally skeptical, to look for inconsistencies in people's stories, and to approach every case with the assumption that someone is probably lying to you about something important. After 28 years in this business, I thought I'd developed an almost supernatural ability to detect deception and uncover the truth behind even the most elaborate schemes. But in March 2018, while investigating a series of hit-and-run cases along Interstate 75 through rural Kentucky, I encountered something that challenged every assumption I'd ever made about the boundary between the living and the dead. The case had been assigned to me because the pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, but too scattered to suggest a single perpetrator. Over the course of 18 months, there had been 7 hit-and-run accidents along a 50-mile stretch of I-75 between London and Corbin, all involving single pedestrians struck by vehicles that fled the scene without stopping to render aid or report the incident. The accidents occurred at different times of day, in different weather conditions, with different types of vehicles based on paint transfer and debris left at the scenes. But there were similarities that suggested something more than random tragedy. All 7 victims were men between the ages of 35 and 50. All were found within a quarter-mile of highway overpasses, and all had been walking along the shoulder rather than attempting to cross the roadway. My company had been hired by the Kentucky State Police to investigate whether these incidents might be connected to an insurance fraud scheme, possibly involving staged pedestrian accidents where the victims were supposed to survive with profitable injuries, but had instead been killed by drivers who panicked and fled rather than following the planned script. It was a theory that made sense from a statistical perspective. Hit-and-run accidents involving pedestrians are unfortunately common, but 7 incidents with such specific commonalities in such a limited geographic area suggested either extraordinary coincidence or deliberate pattern. I'd driven I-75 through Kentucky many times over the years, investigating everything from staged vehicle accidents to suspicious workers' compensation claims in the coal mining regions of eastern Kentucky. It's a stretch of highway that cuts through some of the most economically depressed areas of Appalachia, where legitimate opportunities are scarce and people sometimes turn to insurance fraud as a way to supplement disability payments or unemployment benefits. The landscape is beautiful in a haunting way. Rolling hills covered with forests that turn brilliant colors in the fall, but also dotted with abandoned mining equipment and shuttered businesses that speak to the economic struggles of the region. I was driving my company car, a plain gray sedan that was designed to be forgettable and unremarkable, perfect for surveillance work or investigations where you don't want to draw attention to yourself. The car had been fitted with a dash camera and GPS tracking system, standard equipment for investigators who often work alone in remote areas where backup might be hours away. I'd been on the road for 3 days, photographing accident sites, interviewing witnesses, and reviewing police reports, trying to find connections that might explain the pattern of incidents. That's when I first noticed something unusual about my passenger seat. I was driving north from London toward Corbin, reviewing the details of the most recent accident in my mind, when I glanced over and saw that the seat was adjusted differently than I remembered. The seat was pushed forward and the backrest was angled more upright, as if someone significantly shorter than me had been sitting there and had adjusted it for their comfort. But I'd been traveling alone for the entire trip, and I was certain I hadn't moved the passenger seat since picking up the car from the rental agency in Louisville. I pulled over at the next rest area and got out to check the car, thinking maybe someone had broken in while I was interviewing witnesses or taking photographs at one of the accident sites. But there was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been inside the vehicle without my knowledge. The doors were still locked, the windows were intact, and nothing appeared to be missing from my luggage or investigative equipment. I adjusted the passenger seat back to its normal position and continued driving, chalking up the incident to fatigue or distraction, causing me to misremember how I'd left the seat. But the next morning, the passenger seat was adjusted again, moved to exactly the same position I'd found it the day before. This time, I was certain I hadn't touched it. I'd specifically made a mental note of the seat position before going to bed at the motel, and I'd checked it again when I loaded my equipment into the car. Someone or something was adjusting that seat, and it was happening while the car was locked and parked outside my motel room, under lights that should have made any unauthorized access visible to other guests or motel staff. Over the next 2 days, the seat adjustment became a regular occurrence, always returning to the same position despite my efforts to secure the car or monitor it for unauthorized access. But more disturbing were the other signs that someone appeared to be occupying the passenger seat while I was driving. The seat cushion began to show indentations consistent with someone sitting there, and the seatbelt occasionally appeared to be fastened, even though I never secured it when driving alone. Most unsettling was the way the car's climate control system seemed to respond to the presence of a passenger I couldn't see. The air conditioning would adjust automatically to a cooler setting, as if compensating for additional body heat in the cabin. I started taking photographs of the passenger seat at regular intervals, documenting the indentations and seat adjustments as potential evidence of some kind of automotive malfunction or security breach. But when I reviewed the images later, I noticed something that made my hands shake as I held the camera. In several of the photographs, there appeared to be a faint outline of a person sitting in the passenger seat, not clearly visible, more like a shadow or impression left by someone who had been there moments before the picture was taken. The figure appeared to be a middle-aged man in casual clothing, sitting in a relaxed position as if he were a long-time passenger comfortable with long-distance travel. The breakthrough came when I stopped at a truck stop near Corbin to review my case files and grab something to eat. I was sitting in the restaurant section, going through police reports and witness statements, when I overheard a conversation between two state troopers who were discussing the hit-and-run cases. One of them mentioned that they'd reviewed security camera footage from several businesses along I-75, looking for vehicles that might have been involved in the accidents, and had noticed something unusual in several of the recordings. The strangest thing, one trooper was saying to the other, is that in at least 3 of the videos, you can see what looks like someone sitting in the passenger seat of cars driving past the accident locations. But when we tracked down those vehicles and interviewed the drivers, they all swore they were driving alone. Could be a reflection or camera malfunction, but it's consistent enough to be weird. I introduced myself and showed them my credentials, explaining that I was investigating the same cases for insurance purposes. When I described my experiences with the passenger seat adjustments and the mysterious indentations, both troopers became very interested and agreed to share some of their security camera footage with me. What I saw in those recordings changed my understanding of everything I'd been experiencing during my investigation. The footage showed my gray sedan passing various businesses along I-75, and in every single recording, there was clearly someone sitting in the passenger seat. The figure was more distinct in the security videos than it had been in my photographs. A man in his early 40s, wearing a blue work shirt and jeans, sitting calmly in the passenger seat and occasionally appearing to point or gesture toward locations along the highway. But I knew with absolute certainty that I had been driving alone during all of those recorded passages, that there had been no one in the car with me except whatever presence was making itself known through seat adjustments and indentations. The troopers helped me cross-reference the security footage with the dates and locations of the hit-and-run accidents, and we discovered something that made the case suddenly take on an entirely different character. In every recording where the mysterious passenger was visible, my car was passing within a quarter mile of one of the accident locations, usually within 24 hours of when the incidents had occurred. It was as if the presence in my passenger seat was connected to the accidents themselves, appearing whenever I was near the sites where the victims had been killed. That's when one of the troopers mentioned that they'd been investigating an older case that might be connected to the recent hit-and-runs. In 2016, a Kentucky State Police investigator named Detective Michael Hendricks had been killed in a hit-and-run accident while examining evidence at one of the locations where the recent accidents had occurred. Hendricks had been working alone, photographing skid marks and debris patterns on the shoulder of I-75, when he was struck by a vehicle that fled the scene. The case had never been solved, and Hendricks' death had been treated as a separate incident rather than part of the pattern I was investigating. When they showed me a photograph of Detective Hendricks, I immediately recognized him as the figure I'd been seeing in the security camera footage. Same build, same facial features, same casual demeanor that had struck me as familiar, even though I'd never met him while he was alive. Michael Hendricks had been investigating hit-and-run cases along the same stretch of I-75 where he was eventually killed. And now he appeared to be continuing his investigation from whatever realm police officers go to when their final case remains unsolved. The troopers told me that Hendricks had been known throughout the department as someone who never gave up on a case, who took every unsolved incident as a personal challenge, and worked doggedly to find answers for victims and their families. If anyone was going to come back from the dead to solve his own murder and help other victims, one of them said, it would be Mike Hendricks. He always said that every hit and run was someone's father or brother or son, and that they all deserved justice even if no one else cared enough to keep looking. Over the remaining 3 days of my investigation, I began to view the presence in my passenger seat not as something to be feared, but as a guide who was helping me understand connections I might have missed on my own. The seat adjustment started to feel like gentle suggestions about where to look or what to examine more closely. When the passenger seat moved forward, it usually meant I should slow down and pay closer attention to roadside evidence. When the indentations deepened, it suggested I should stop and photograph whatever location I was passing. Following these subtle suggestions, I was able to identify paint transfer evidence that had been overlooked at 2 of the accident scenes, fragments that eventually led to the identification of vehicles involved in 3 of the hit-and-runs. More importantly, I found a pattern in the timing and locations that suggested the incidents were indeed connected. Not as insurance fraud, but as the work of multiple drivers who were part of an illegal racing group that used I-75 for high-speed runs during specific weather conditions and times of night. My final report to the Kentucky State Police identified the racing group and provided evidence that led to arrests in 5 of the 7 cases, including new charges in the death of Detective Michael Hendricks. The case was closed officially, but I knew that the real credit belonged to a dead police officer who had refused to let his own murder and the deaths of 7 innocent men go unsolved. I returned the rental car to the agency in Louisville, and when I got out to complete the paperwork, I noticed that the passenger seat had been adjusted one final time. But instead of the forward, upright position that Michael Hendricks had preferred, was now set back to the default position where I'd originally found it, as if my invisible partner was signing off from the case and returning the vehicle to its normal configuration. I never saw Detective Hendricks again. But sometimes when I'm working hit-and-run cases in other parts of the country, I find myself checking the passenger seat and hoping that some other dedicated officer is still out there, still looking out for investigators who are trying to find justice for victims whose voices have been silenced but whose cases deserve to be solved. My name is Adeline, and I make my living as a travel photographer and blogger, documenting hidden gems and off-the-beaten-path destinations throughout the American West. I've spent the last 5 years living out of a converted van, chasing perfect light and unique landscapes from Alaska to Mexico, building a following of people who crave authentic travel experiences away from the crowded tourist traps. My specialty is finding those magical places that most people drive past without noticing. Abandoned ghost towns, natural formations that don't appear on any map, viewpoints that offer perspectives you can't get anywhere else in the world. But in August 2021, while photographing scenic overlooks along the Pacific Coast Highway through Big Sur, I discovered that some locations exist in more than one time period simultaneously, and my camera somehow captured layers of history that shouldn't be visible to the naked eye. I was working on a project about California's most photogenic highway pullouts, The kind of spots where you can park safely and capture the dramatic meeting of mountains and ocean that makes the Pacific Coast Highway one of the world's most scenic drives. Big Sur is a photographer's paradise. Every mile offers new compositions, different lighting conditions, and seasonal changes that transform familiar locations into completely new subjects. I'd driven this route dozens of times over the years, but I was always discovering new angles and perspectives that I'd somehow missed on previous trips. The van I was traveling in was a 2018 Ford Transit that I'd converted into a mobile photography studio and living space. The back was equipped with everything I needed for extended road trips: a bed, a small kitchen, storage for camera equipment, and a workstation where I could edit photos and update my blog. Solar panels on the roof kept my batteries charged, and a cellular booster ensured I could stay connected even in remote areas where regular cell service was spotty. It was the perfect setup for someone whose job required both mobility and the ability to work from wherever the best shots might be found. I'd been driving south from San Francisco toward Los Angeles, taking my time and stopping at every scenic overlook that caught my eye. The weather was perfect: clear skies, moderate temperatures, and the kind of golden afternoon light that makes everything look like it belongs in a travel magazine. I was looking for shots that captured not just the beauty of the landscape, but the sense of adventure and freedom that comes from exploring California's most dramatic coastline. My blog readers were always asking for recommendations about where to stop and what to photograph. So I was documenting GPS coordinates and access information along with the artistic shots. The overlook where everything started to go wrong was at mile marker 31. A small pull-out carved into the cliff face that offered panoramic views of the coastline stretching north and south as far as the eye could see. Wasn't marked on any of my maps or mentioned in any of the guidebooks I carried, but it was clearly a legitimate scenic viewpoint with proper safety barriers and a paved parking area that could accommodate maybe 6 or 8 vehicles. The view was spectacular: waves crashing against sea stacks hundreds of feet below, mountains rising inland covered with redwood forests, and the highway itself winding along the cliff face like a ribbon of asphalt connecting isolated communities along one of the most rugged coastlines in North America. I set up my camera equipment and started shooting, using both a wide-angle lens to capture the full scope of the landscape and a telephoto lens to isolate specific compositional elements. The light was changing rapidly as the sun moved lower in the sky, creating different moods and color temperatures that would give my blog readers a sense of how dramatically the same location could change throughout the day. I was shooting in both RAW and JPEG formats, with the RAW files giving me maximum flexibility for post-processing, and the JPEG files serving as quick previews I could review on the camera's LCD screen. That's when I noticed something unusual about the images I was capturing. The JPEG previews on my camera showed the scene exactly as I was seeing it. Modern highway with contemporary guardrails, recent model cars passing by in the distance, and the kind of developed infrastructure you'd expect along a major tourist route. But when I looked at the same shots later on my laptop, the RAW files showed the same basic landscape, but with significant differences in the details that should have been impossible given that I was photographing the exact same location at the exact same time. In the RAW files, the highway looked older, narrower pavement, different style guardrails, and vintage cars from what appeared to be the 1960s or 70s passing by instead of modern vehicles. The overlook itself looked less developed, with wooden barriers instead of modern steel and concrete safety rails, and vegetation that appeared wilder and less maintained than what I was actually seeing. Most disturbing, there were people in some of the shots who hadn't been there when I took the photographs. Families posing for pictures in clothing that looked like it belonged to an earlier era. Children playing in areas that were now restricted for safety reasons. At first, I assumed it was some kind of camera malfunction or processing error. Digital cameras are sophisticated computers, and like any complex technology, they can develop glitches that affect image quality or data integrity. I tried different memory cards, different camera settings, and even a different camera body. But the results were consistent. The JPEG files showed the present, while the RAW files seemed to be capturing the same location at different points in the past. The technical specifications of both file types were identical, ruling out any obvious mechanical or software problems with the equipment. I spent the next 3 hours at that overlook, taking hundreds of photographs and trying to understand what was happening. The phenomenon became more pronounced as the sun got lower in the sky, with the raw files showing increasingly dramatic differences from what I was actually observing. I began to see structures in the processed images that had clearly been built and then demolished decades before my visit. Old-style visitor facilities, different road configurations, even what appeared to be a small restaurant or gift shop that existed in the photographs, but had no physical trace in the current landscape. The people in the historical images began to interact with my camera, as if they could see me taking their photographs despite the fact that they were apparently existing in a different time period. Children would wave at the camera, couples would pose for pictures, and families would gather together as if they knew someone was documenting their visit to this scenic overlook. But when I looked away from the camera and scanned the actual overlook with my naked eyes, I was completely alone. No other visitors, no sounds except the wind and the waves far below. No sign of human presence other than my own van and photography equipment. The most unsettling images were the ones that seemed to show the same location during different historical periods simultaneously, as if multiple timelines were overlapping in the same physical space. I captured shots that showed modern guardrails in the foreground with vintage cars passing on a highway that looked like it was from the 1960s, or contemporary safety barriers protecting visitors who were dressed in clothing from the 1970s. The lighting and shadows were consistent throughout each image, suggesting that these weren't composite photographs or double exposures, but genuine captures of a location where different time periods were somehow coexisting. As the sun began to set, the temporal layers in my photographs became more complex and historically significant. I started seeing images of what appeared to be the original construction of the Pacific Coast Highway, with workers in period-appropriate clothing and equipment that dated back to the 1930s. There were shots of what looked like early tourists visiting the area in cars from the 1940s and 50s, families on road trips during the golden age of American highway travel. Some images seemed to show the overlook during World War II, when the coastline was under military surveillance and civilian access was restricted. The most historically significant images appeared to show the area before any development at all, when the coastline was inhabited only by Native American communities who had lived along this stretch of the Pacific for thousands of years. These photographs showed people in traditional clothing using trails that followed the natural contours of the cliffs, fishing from rocks that had since been altered by highway construction, and living in harmony with a landscape that existed long before European settlement and the development of modern transportation infrastructure. By the time I packed up my equipment and prepared to leave the overlook, I had documented what appeared to be a complete visual history of the location spanning from prehistoric times to the present day. But as I reviewed the images on my laptop that evening, I realized that they were changing before my eyes. Details that had been clearly visible in the afternoon were beginning to fade, colors were shifting, and entire figures were disappearing as if the temporal connection between different time periods was weakening as I moved away from the specific location where I'd captured the photographs. Within a week, most of the historical elements had vanished entirely, leaving me with conventional landscape photographs that showed only the contemporary scene I had actually observed. The vintage cars became modern vehicles. The period-dressed families disappeared completely, and the older infrastructure reverted to its current configuration. It was as if the overlook had been temporarily permeable to other time periods, allowing my camera to capture multiple layers of history simultaneously. But the connection had been severed once I left the immediate area. I returned to the same overlook 3 more times over the following months, always at the same time of day and under similar lighting conditions. But I never again captured anything beyond conventional landscape photographs. The location appeared completely normal, with no sign of the temporal anomalies that had allowed me to document its layered history. Other photographers I spoke with had never experienced anything similar. And attempts to research the specific history of mile marker 31 turned up no records of any unusual phenomena or reports of similar experiences. The only evidence I have left of what happened that day is a single photograph that somehow retained its historical elements, even after all the others had reverted to normal contemporary images. It shows the overlook as it exists today, but with a family from what appears to be the 1960s posed in the foreground, waving at the camera as if they could see me taking their picture across more than half a century of time. The image is technically perfect, with no signs of manipulation or composite work. But it shows something that should be impossible. A moment when the past and present occupied the same physical space, and my camera was able to capture both simultaneously. I've never posted that photograph to my blog or shared it on social media, partly because I know it would be dismissed as fake, and partly because it feels too personal and mysterious to turn into content for public consumption. Instead, I keep it as a reminder that some locations hold on to their history in ways we don't fully understand, and that sometimes the most amazing discoveries happen when we're least expecting them. The overlook at mile marker 31 looks like just another scenic pullout along the Pacific Coast Highway. But for one afternoon in August 2021, it became a window into every era of human presence, along one of California's most beautiful and historically significant stretches of coastline. I still travel the same routes and photograph the same types of locations. But now, I pay closer attention to places that feel somehow different from their surroundings, locations that seem to hold more history than their appearance would suggest. And sometimes, when the light is just right and the conditions are perfect, I wonder if my camera might capture something that exists outside the normal flow of time, something that connects us to all the travelers who came before us and all the stories that these scenic overlooks have witnessed over the decades and centuries since people first stopped to admire the meeting of land and sea along California's magnificent coast. My name is Apollo, and at 67 years old, I've been making the same drive for the last 15 years. From my small apartment in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to my daughter's house in Dubuque, where I get to spend precious time with my grandchildren, Emma and Jacob. The route is simple and familiar. Just 93 miles of mostly rural highway through the heart of Iowa farmland, past fields of corn and soybean that change with the seasons like a living calendar. I've made this trip hundreds of times in my old Ford pickup truck, always taking Highway 151 north through the small towns of Cascade and Dyersville, then connecting to Highway 20 for the final stretch into Dubuque. It's the kind of drive that becomes automatic after a while, where your hands know every curve and your mind can wander to pleasant thoughts of family dinners and grandchildren's laughter. But in September 2019, something went wrong with those final 5 miles, and I found myself trapped in a loop of road that refused to let me reach my destination, forcing me to confront a truth I wasn't ready to accept about my own mortality. I'd retired from the Postal Service 3 years earlier after 42 years of delivering mail through Iowa winters and summers, building relationships with every family on my route and watching neighborhoods change as children grew up and moved away. The job had been good to me. Steady work, decent benefits, and the kind of routine that gave structure to my days. But retirement had been an adjustment, especially after my wife Helen passed away from cancer 2 years ago. The house felt too empty, the days too long, and the silence too complete without her humming in the kitchen or calling my name from the garden. That's why these visits to Sarah's house had become so important to me. They were the bright spots in weeks that sometimes felt gray and endless. Reminders that life continues and families grow even when individual chapters come to an end. The drive to Dubuque had always been therapeutic. A time when I could listen to old country music on the radio and think about Helen, about the grandchildren, about plans for the future that felt more precious now that I understood how quickly time can slip away. The Iowa landscape has a quiet beauty that some people overlook. Rolling hills covered with crops that stretch to the horizon, farmhouses with wraparound porches where families still gather for Sunday dinners, barns and grain silos that serve as landmarks for navigation and memory. I knew every mile of that route, every crossroads and water tower, every place where deer might cross the highway at dusk, and every hill where you could see for miles in every direction. On this particular Friday afternoon in September, I'd left Cedar Rapids right on schedule at 2 p.m., planning to arrive in Dubuque by 4:30 for an early dinner with Sarah's family. Emma, who was 8, was excited to show me a school project about Iowa history, and Jacob, who was 6, had been practicing a song on his recorder that he wanted to perform for Grandpa Apollo. These were the moments that made everything worthwhile, the pure joy on their faces when I walked through the door, the way they competed for my attention during dinner, the stories they told about school and friends, and the important events in their young lives that seemed momentous and fascinating when seen through their eyes. The trip started normally enough. I filled up the truck at my usual gas station, checked the oil and tire pressure the way I'd been doing for 50 years of driving, and headed north on Highway 151 with a cooler full of homemade cookies that I'd spent the morning baking for the grandchildren. The radio was playing Merle Haggard, and the late afternoon sun was creating that golden light that photographers love, making the cornfields look like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. I was thinking about Helen, how she used to love these drives to visit Sarah, how she'd point out changes in the farms we passed and speculate about the lives of the people who lived in the houses scattered across the landscape. The trouble started when I reached what should have been the final 5 miles of the journey. I'd passed all the familiar landmarks, the red barn with the mail pouch tobacco sign painted on the side, the historic church with the tall steeple that you could see from miles away, the crossroads where Highway 151 intersected with the county road that led to the Amana colonies. According to my odometer and my internal GPS developed over years of making this same trip, I should have been 5 miles from Sarah's house, close enough to start anticipating the excited voices of Emma and Jacob when they heard my truck in the driveway. But those 5 miles seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me. I drove for what felt like 20 minutes at my usual speed of 55 miles per hour, watching for the familiar signs that marked the approach to Dubuque. The water tower with the city name painted in blue letters, the billboard advertising the local casino, the cluster of farm equipment dealerships that indicated the transition from rural highway to suburban development. But none of these landmarks appeared. Instead, the road continued in a straight line through identical farmland, with the same style of fields and fences and farmhouses repeating in a pattern that should have been impossible given the actual geography of the area. I began to worry that I'd somehow missed a turn or taken a wrong exit, despite having driven this route hundreds of times without ever getting lost. I pulled over at what appeared to be a familiar gas station. The same brand, the same layout, the same elderly attendant who'd been working there for years. But when I asked for directions to Dubuque, he looked at me with confusion and said he'd never heard of any city by that name. The fuel gauge on my truck showed exactly half a tank, the same level it had been showing for the past hour of driving, as if the engine weren't consuming gasoline, or as if distance and time had somehow become disconnected from normal physical laws. I tried calling Sarah on my cell phone to let her know I was running late, but the calls wouldn't connect. The phone showed full signal strength, but every call attempt resulted in a busy signal or message saying the number was no longer in service. When I tried calling other numbers, my own doctor, the grocery store where I shopped, even the time and temperature service, I got the same results. It was as if my phone could see the network but couldn't actually connect to the outside world, leaving me isolated in a bubble of highway that existed separately from the rest of reality. The sun began to set, but instead of continuing its normal arc toward the western horizon, it seemed to freeze in place, casting the same golden late afternoon light that never progressed toward evening. The digital clock on my truck's dashboard had stopped at 4:15 p.m., the exact time when I should have been pulling into Sarah's driveway to be greeted by running grandchildren and the warm smell of pot roast from the kitchen. But instead of family dinner, I was trapped on an endless stretch of highway that refused to deliver me to my destination. As I continued driving, I began to encounter other vehicles that seemed to be stuck in the same loop. An elderly woman in a blue Buick who looked lost and frightened, a middle-aged man in a work truck who kept checking his watch and shaking his head, a young couple in a minivan with children's voices audible through their windows. When I tried to flag them down or get their attention, they seemed to see me but couldn't hear me, as if we were all existing in parallel versions of the same road, close enough to observe each other, but unable to communicate or help. The farmland began to look increasingly familiar, not just in general characteristics, but in specific details that suggested I was passing the same locations over and over again. The red barn with the mail pouch sign, the historic church, the crossroads, all the landmarks I'd passed an hour earlier were appearing again in exactly the same sequence, as if the 5-mile stretch of highway were somehow looped back on itself, creating a closed circuit that had no exit or destination. That's when I began to understand what was really happening. The memories started coming back in fragments. The chest pains that had been getting worse over the past few months. The appointment with the cardiologist that I'd been putting off. The moment of sharp pain and dizziness that had struck just as I was approaching the final stretch of highway toward Sarah's house. I remembered the truck veering off the road, the sensation of spinning, the impact that had seemed to last both forever and no time at all. The endless highway wasn't a supernatural trap or a glitch in reality. It was my mind's way of avoiding the truth I wasn't ready to face. I was dying, or already dead. And the final 5 miles of my journey to see my grandchildren had become a metaphor for the distance between life and whatever comes after. The familiar route, the golden afternoon light, the sense of anticipation about reaching my destination. These were the last thoughts my consciousness was clinging to, the final moments of a life spent traveling between the people I loved. I pulled the truck over to the side of the highway and sat there as the truth settled over me like the Iowa dusk that never seemed to come. In the distance, I could see lights that might have been Sarah's house, or might have been something else entirely. A destination that existed beyond the boundaries of the physical world, where Emma and Jacob were probably still waiting for their grandpa Apollo to arrive with homemade cookies and stories about the Postal Service and endless patience for recorder concerts and school projects. The choice, I realized, was mine. I could keep driving this loop forever, maintaining the illusion that I was still traveling toward a family dinner that would never come. Or I could accept that some journeys have different destinations than the ones we originally planned. I could stay in this comfortable bubble of anticipation and routine. Or I could face the unknown territory that lay beyond the familiar highways of life I'd been traveling for 67 years. I put the truck in drive and headed toward those distant lights, not knowing whether they led to Sarah's house or somewhere else entirely, but understanding finally that the most important journeys are the ones where you can't see the destination until you're brave enough to reach it. The highway began to change, becoming less familiar but more beautiful, leading toward a horizon that promised reunion with Helen and adventures I'd never imagined. Behind me, the loop of familiar highway faded away, taking with it the illusion that I could postpone this final journey indefinitely. Ahead of me lay whatever comes after the last mile marker, whatever destination waits for postal workers who spent their lives delivering messages, and grandparents who measured their wealth in the laughter of children and the love of families who will remember them long after the old Ford pickup has made its final delivery. If you've made it this far through these 11 disturbing encounters on America's haunted highways, then you know that the road holds more mysteries than any of us can fully understand. These aren't just stories. They're warnings. Reminders that every mile marker could be your last. Every exit could lead to somewhere you never intended to go. And every journey could become something far stranger and more terrifying than you ever imagined. The next time you find yourself driving alone on a dark highway, remember these accounts and pay attention to what your headlights reveal in the darkness ahead. Subscribe to Verified Fears for more true horror stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the world around us. And remember that sometimes the most dangerous roads are the ones we travel every day without realizing how haunted they really are.